The following podcast is brought to you by CDKOffers.com. Use offer code DIESHRINK for 3% off everything on the website and Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows codes. All right, on with the show. Okay, and welcome to Broken Silicon, a computer gaming and hardware podcast. I'm your host, Tom, and I will let my esteemed guest introduce himself.
All right, thanks, Tom. My name is Daniel Nenni. I'm a longtime semiconductor professional, father of four. I live here right outside of Silicon Valley. I've been here most of my life. And in the last 10 years, I've started writing and documenting my experiences throughout the semiconductor industry. I started in the early 1980s, which was an interesting time. And now we've made a huge transformation, a couple different transformations. So there really is a lot to write about.
What would you say, I mean, just thinking here based on what you said, the biggest difference between, and maybe there's a few you want to mention, between the semiconductor industry in the 1980s and, what, 40 years later?
36 for me. I got married right out of college, so my marriage anniversary and my work anniversary is the same thing, so it's easier to remember. When I first came into the business, computer companies really drove the semiconductor industry. So these were mini computers. So before mini computers, we had mainframes, these big things that were in, the buildings hiding somewhere. Mini computers were a little more portable. So when I was in college, we used mini computers to learn how to program and do computer engineering. So there were IBM 360s, HP, Data General, Digital Equipment. Those are the four big vendors. But those guys made their own chips. So they drove the semiconductor industry. And, you only had one mainframe for a company, whereas mini computers were spread around. So there was many more, silicon chips to be found throughout your building. So that was kind of the birth of the semiconductor industry into the mainstream, markets.
And they all had their own fabs too, most of the time, didn't they?
They all did. In fact, my first job was at a fab here in Silicon Valley, making chips for a computer company. And it was just the way it was. You had no other choice. And it was viewed as a competitive advantage if you were making your own chips. So they made their own CPUs, they made their own IO chips, everything they did their own. And back then, CPUs was a board full of chips, right? In fact, sometimes multiple boards. It took multiple chips, multiple boards to make a CPU. The big change there was when Intel and Motorola came around and said, hey, we're going to make a general purpose CPU. Anybody can use it. And by the way, you can use the same software. You didn't have to write your own code. And so that was a pretty big transformation. That's when the computer companies, such as Data General and Digital Equipment and Prime, that's really was the beginning of their end. So Intel and Motorola really put them out of business.
So, not to get ahead of ourselves here, but I guess, of course, now there's a lot of, dedicated fabs that everyone goes to. They don't own the fabs. That's still true after that transformation. But do you think we could transition back into an era where people are designing their own chips again? Apple's doing that now, or at least they're going to try to.
Well, so when computer manufacturers ceased to exist, we had these companies called IDMs. So it's called an integrated device manufacturer. And so they were just making chips, and Intel and Motorola were IDMs. And, it was just a better business model where you could buy these chips on the open market and you could run a single operating system and you can run all the software. So it was a natural progression. So IDMs sprung up everywhere, and they also had their own fabs. But since they had much higher volumes because they were selling chips to everybody, not just to their internal use, the economies of scale made it so, it could be quite a profitable business. And, there still are some IDMs around, of course, Intel, Texas Instruments, there's quite a few, but not as many as before, of course, because it is very tough to continue to build your own fabs and your own processes. and be competitive with the rest of the world.
So, and that's starting to get into some of the notes here that I wrote down for us to discuss. I mean, why was it seen as an advantage to own your own fab? I mean, most people could maybe guess the mindset, but I mean, like, literally, why do you think most people would have said they had their own fabs back then?
Well, have you heard the saying, real men have their own fabs?
I have, yeah. I think I read that in your book too.
So, that's something that everybody in Silicon Valley knows. It's attributed to the guy from AMD, but it actually wasn't him who said it. The founder of Cypress Semiconductors said it, but it just caught on. And Jerry Sanders, the president of AMD, kind of had he had a really big ego, and he got up and yelled, "Real men have fabs," right? So there was a lot of ego going on with it, as well as the ability to customize your chips. So do you really want to be using the same chips as everybody else? How do you differentiate, your product when you're just tagging on with the other guy's silicon? So, one of the chapters in the book is about Xilinx. Are you familiar with Xilinx? Have you heard them before?
I'm aware of the name, but I'm not super familiar.
Yeah, so there was two companies that I attribute to being the first fabless companies, and Xilinx and Chips and Technologies. Xilinx is a programmable company. They make programmable devices. They're number one in the industry for their market share. But when they did their business plan, and there's a copy of their business plan here in the Computer Museum in Mountain View, they included a fab, even though they had no intention of building one. Because these guys with big fabs, it's very hard to keep them busy around the clock, right? Because if you have a slump in your business, your fab still has to run to make money. So the big IDMs were leasing out their fab space to other companies. That's how the fabless business started. So Xilinx got a couple of companies, a Japanese company and a U.S. company, and said, "Hey, listen, can we borrow some of your fab space? We're doing a programmable product." And it wasn't a big deal because nobody was doing a product like Xilinx. So it's not like they were competing with the companies they were fabbing with. But they actually put it in their business plan. That was the only way they could raise money for a semiconductor company, because the venture capitals, the funding arm, said, "Hey, Jerry Sanders says real men have fabs, so you guys have a fab, or we're not giving you any money." But it was a little bit fraudulent if you think about it, but it worked out well, so everybody's happy. But if it didn't work out well, there probably would have been some legal issues there.
I mean, yeah, because that's something I was thinking about, like kind of scanning through your book. And I mean, just thinking about this stuff recently with, how much discussion there is about, like, for instance, TSMC's lead. Can anyone catch up to them? When you look back at when everyone owned their own fab, I myself couldn't come up with a good reason in hindsight that you would want one. I mean, I think the best engineering argument you could make is, well, if we design this node, we can design it around our needs, right? And then that's an advantage we can wield, that only we have this node for these products. But at the end of the day, I feel like that often has held, that they'll hold each other back. Like, oh, this node needs to be this way, and so we're going to focus on that. But then that might delay the chip's design, or vice versa. I mean, is that an incorrect assumption of why it can be a hindrance to own a fab?
Well, yeah, as it turns out, we know. But when we had our fabs, you could also guarantee capacity, right? Mm-hmm. You had control over your design, over your capacity. You could guarantee X amount of chips by building your own fabs. But if you're renting space, what happens if there's other renters that will pay more money? It's supply and demand. So the fabless concept really is a little bit frightening if you think about it. Way back when, right? Way back when. And that's why, all the banks and the investors said, "Hey, you got to have your own fab, control your own destiny," right? And when TSMC came out, so I was in the industry. That sounds
flashy, right?
Yeah.
Control your own destiny. But what does that really mean, right?
Control your own silicon.
Yeah.
Now it has different meanings, right? But, one of the companies that rented out their fabs was Texas Instruments. And one of the executives at Texas Instruments was Morris Chang. So he's the founder of TSMC.
Right.
And so that's where he got the idea for the business. Is he was renting out fab space, And, they were very selective who they rented it to because they weren't going to rent it to a company that was going to compete with them, right? Because that doesn't make sense. But Morris Chang said, hey, there's a business here. We need to, open up the manufacturing, economies of scale, do it cheaper. And he went back to Taiwan and he pitched it. And the Taiwanese government and Philips, by the way, Semiconductor, were some of the early investors. And, without the Taiwanese government's backing, they never would have made it because manufacturing semiconductors is very expensive. And back then it was very hazardous, by the way. There's a lot of chemicals and
I'm sure.
toxic
I've seen
waste.
the stories.
Yeah. Yeah. When my wife and I decided to have children, she looked around and, where the safe water and safe, environment was and the incidence of birth defects. And in Silicon Valley, it was a big problem. So we actually moved 40 miles north to a more suburban location to have children because she was concerned because we had all these fabs around and they really weren't regulated. But what the U.S. government did, and if you want to know the honest answer of why manufacturing went overseas is because back then we didn't have the ability to keep them clean. And, I remember working in a fab and it had one of those signs that says this many days since an accident. It never hit double digits because there was always something going wrong. And because we were in the forefront of semiconductor manufacturing technology, right? So we didn't know. But now semiconductor fabs are very green. In fact, TSMC had their symposium this week. So Monday and Tuesday, it was online this year. But they did a whole speech about their fabs and how green they are. And so, we could bring, just as a side note, we could bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States in a very eco-friendly manner. But, 35, 40 years ago, that wasn't the case.
It's interesting you say that, too, because as usual, if anything goes overseas, everyone assumes it's cost. But when I look at some of these manufacturing locations, I'm like, a lot of this is automated, and the people you're hiring, no matter where they are in the world, are probably going to have to be paid decently. There's only a handful of people that can do a lot of these jobs running fabs. So you're saying that started overseas. I'm sure some of it was cost, right? But it was also just regulations.
Yeah. But you have to remember back then we weren't automated. And so there was a lot of people. And, for example, one of my jobs was carrying wafers. We would literally carry the wafers around to each station and load them in. And now if you go into a fab, I'm very fortunate to have toured dozens of fabs. I've been all over the world. And it looks like something out of Star Wars, right? And rarely will you see a person. Seriously, you will not see a person. So that's just a big difference between back then and today. It's completely automated. It's very safe environmentally, and the water that comes out of the fabs is now cleaner than the water that goes in. So
yes,
it's a different
world. That's true of a lot
of
factories now too in the U.S.
Oh yeah, you have to, right? But the mindset is still there of fabs being dirty, right? So that's not the case.
Yeah,
and you don't need a bunch of people. So, having a fab in your town is not going to help employment really much at all.
No. Yeah. The example I was going to give is I remember I worked for General Motors during the Flint, Michigan lead water crisis thing. And it was one of the first places that discovered the lead in the water was General Motors testing facility, where they said their machines were having issues with the water they were piping in, and that they were worried that it was too dirty for their cars. And they're like, this isn't going anywhere else, is it?
Yeah, groundwater. That's what my wife looked at when we were going to have children, and the groundwater was a problem, and the incidence of birth defects and issues. And, it's just a lot of people, it's out of sight, out of mind, but it will come back and get you at some point in time.
Yeah, you can try to disregard it, but it is real and it does affect your health.
As we found out.
Yeah. An interesting comparison I saw in your book, which, wait, why don't you plug your book? What's the name? It's Fabless, right?
Yeah, I've written quite a few books, actually, if you look me up on Amazon. But the first book I wrote was Fabless, The Transformation of the Semiconductor Industry. And, I wrote it for a couple of reasons. One is back then, the semiconductor industry didn't get a lot of press. So I started a website called SemiWiki.com, and it's an open forum for semiconductor professionals. So we only allow semiconductor people on there so we can talk openly about the challenges we have and what the problems are that we're solving. Because the mainstream media pretty much ignored us back then. And my kids, I have 4 millennial kids. They had no idea what semiconductors were or anything. So I wrote this book, and they didn't read it, so they still don't know. But we developed these semiconductors, and there really are a big part of modern life, right? I mean, if you think about it, without semiconductors, we're in trouble. In fact, if you look at the semiconductor industry right now, we're doing quite well compared to other industries. And, the reason is people will not give up their phones. And everybody's going into the cloud with Zoom and everything. So, that's all semiconductors. So we're having a pretty good year, and it'll continue to be so. And, the thing you have to think of is what's going to happen if our semiconductors get restricted or limited or, trade embargoes or stuff. And it's really not a pretty picture because people will not give up their phones. They will give up food before they give up their phones.
Well, I mean, yeah, and at least at first people would argue that I have enough food too. So it would make sense that I think some people would trade that. One thing I'd bring up too is an interesting comparison in this book is comparing the silicon business to the pharmaceutical business. I thought that was all of this money that goes into designing the chips or coming up with a hopefully, safe drug. But once you start making it, it's like cents per chip or per chemical. I mean, I guess I don't know if you wanted to talk about that at all, because I think a lot of people and a lot of my fans are PC gamers or console gamers or something, and they're curious about what's coming, the chips that go into their gaming devices. I mean, and there's a lot of, I think, misconceptions about R&D costs and how it affects things. That the reason, for instance, you might get a gaming console for $400 is because of the economy of scale. And quite literally, once it's designed, that console doesn't actually cost that much to make.
Right. So, the thing about the consoles is keep the console cheap and, charge them for the games. The comparison I made to the pharmaceutical company, I have issues with the pharmaceutical company. So was kind of a personal thing is, drugs don't get cheaper. And there's a lot of R&D involved in making drugs, I understand, but there's a lot of R&D involved in making chips. And the difference is chips have continued to get cheaper every year. I mean, I have graphs, I have charts, we track these things. And the number of transistors you put on a chip and the manufacturing process and the packaging process allows us to put more features in one of these chips every year. And the cost doesn't go up, right? So, the cost that they're selling these chips for is pretty standard, but the number of transistors, the number of features on each chip goes up dramatically. And that's something that other industries don't do, right? So cars, I think drug companies are the easiest one because, my God, you charge $100 for a pill, right? And the prices don't go down the more they manufacture. But with semiconductors, they most certainly do. And that's how we got the portable electronics, right? I mean, they have to be cheap. And without cheap semiconductors, we would have not had smartphones, right?
Well, wouldn't you say the difference, though, is when it comes to semiconductors, and I guess at a certain point you could argue this isn't true, really, but I mean, it's a luxury, right? So let's say I want a faster graphics card. I don't actually need a faster graphics card. The one I've had, frankly, the one I had 3 years ago would still run all the games I have now. Whereas the reason, and then there's just so much enormous competition in the silicon space as well that it'd be, unless you can command an absurd performance lead, it's usually suicide, right? To raise prices. And then in the drug industry, though, I think it's just a lot of, well, you could argue we've been making do without a lot of these drugs before, but they prolong lives or they remove pain. And so I think people, see it less of a luxury and more of a something they need. There's obviously a lot of other things affecting drug prices as well.
Yeah, I was just doing a manufacturing model for that. Obviously, drugs and semiconductors aren't the same, although some people say games are drug-like. And, we make smartphones, and, I have 4 millennial children, and they have these phones glued to their head. I used to, ground my children if they did something wrong, and they were pretty happy to go to their room as long as they had their phone. So, it's a different world. But if you look at semiconductors, especially with the cars now, so cars have a huge amount of semiconductor content in it. Your home does, your phones do,
everything, pretty much
everything. And there are many more semiconductors in the medical market than there have ever been. So, I think it's going to be a pretty close call between semiconductors' importance of life and other things. But that brings us, to where we are today, which is, we're still trying to make faster, cheaper semiconductors, and to make them cheaper, we have to put more on a chip. And what's nice is they have these things called teardowns now that they didn't used to have in my day. In my day, we had to tear it down ourselves. But if you look at the Apple phone teardowns, it will give you an example of the advancements, because the first iPhones had a lot of chips in them, and they have one main chip called an SoC. And the second book I wrote is actually on SoCs. It's called Mobile Unleashed. So the first half of the book is a close look at the technology that ARM provides. There's a company, ARM. I'm sure you've heard of them. So I did it's a history of ARM and how they brought their architecture to the industry. And, it was a calamity of errors, actually. And then the second half of the book looks at 3 different companies, Samsung, Qualcomm, and Apple, of how they became, semiconductor manufacturers and how they came to dominate the SoC market. But, Apple's the best story because, I grew up with Apple. They made these, goofy computers way back when, the Apple II and the Macintosh, and, they were more toys. But Apple decided they were going to build their own semiconductors, and they were going to make, portable devices. And so they made the iPod, the iPad, and the iPhone. And the SoC that powered these things absorbed all the other chips that surrounded it. So, instead of having a dozen chips in your phone, you have 1 or 2 or 3. But if you look at the teardowns over the years, you can see how the SoCs have evolved, and they consumed the graphics, they consumed all the different other parts, the modem. So now you can get everything in one chip, and that really that type of consolidation in a chip has fueled Moore's law. So that really brought mobile electronics to the world. So the second book documents that. It's not as interesting in this first book because it's very technical, but it's kind of the chapter on Apple. It's definitely worth reading, and Qualcomm.
Yeah, and it seems like with SoC is we're not adding more chips, but we're just adding more and more dedicated components to SoCs as we move forward, right? Like that's a way of continuing to scale performance over time, right? If we can't just make the processors faster, and eventually I don't know if there's a point in putting 64 cores in your iPhone, probably not, but you can put like a dedicated chip for just like processing images like from the camera quickly, or a dedicated chip. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's benefits of integration. One of them is cost, of course, and the other one is form factor. Because you have to have battery powered devices, and the more chips, the more battery. But another thing is performance. So if you take 4 chips that are communicating externally on a printed circuit board and put them into one, the communication between them is so much faster. For example, a GPU and a CPU. If the GPU and CPU are sitting inside of a chip together, it's just so much faster. So, that's why when we talk about Moore's law or we talk about scaling, there's much more than just the transistor itself.
Yes.
It's the surrounding environment. And so, one of the things we do is we put, and inside these plastic containers that with the little legs on them is this thing called a die. And that is the actual semiconductor device. So we have the ability to put multiple die in a package now. And if you have all the components on a single die, it's very fast. If you have multiple dies, it's still pretty fast. If you have multiple chips, then it gets slower, right? Because the
Yes.
communication links. But you can put two dies together and using a high-speed communications bus and get a very, very good performance. FPGAs are an example of that. Some of the latest FPGAs, they have two dies in a package. So you can get twice the capacity in one package just by putting two die right next to each other. FPGAs are kind of easy because they're the same thing, just repeated over and over. They're storage, cells and such. For an SoC, it's a little bit different because you have different functions. You have a modem, you have a GPU, you have a CPU. But Apple has done. They're the world leader in SoC design, which is pretty amazing because they're not even a semiconductor company, right? They're a systems company.
Well, I mean, that's the thing I've started to argue low-key in some of my podcasts is when you see Apple hiring, people say, well, Apple's not Intel or AMD. And it's like, well, until they just hire people that used to work at AMD or Intel, right? They can hire those people, guys. And as their teams continue to grow and they design their own chips, yeah, I don't know. I'm not so sure Apple isn't going to be thought of as a silicon company soon. And actually another thing you said that I thought is interesting is, at Hot Chips this year, obviously not I guess, remotely watching it. It's funny how just a few years ago, AMD, a lot of people were betting AMD would fail, that it was a huge, bold move to put these different dies together, like you're saying, right? And now it seemed like every company at Hot Chips was talking about their new high-speed fabric and putting multiple dies together. It's so obvious that AMD was one of the early I don't know if early, but one of the there were companies before that did this, but one of the big companies in the past few years to really realize that to scale Moore's law, you just need to start having a good fabric for putting multiple dies together.
Yeah, we've actually been doing that for quite some time. So,
yeah.
Don't kid yourself. It's nothing new. The only new thing is they call them chiplets now, which is a cool, name, right? And
it's
so when you have catchy names, then the media picks up on it, and now it's chiplet this, chiplet that. But we've been actually doing it for quite some time. That's just another piece of the equation. I actually am not a fan of chiplets because it's cheating, right? So if you use a chiplet, you can do a different processes on the same chip. So generally a die is one process. So 7 nanometer, 7 nanometer. You can put 20 nanometer chiplets on a 7 nanometer die. And, you can say, hey, it's a 7 nanometer chip. But then if you look at it, it's like, well, hey, wait, you have more 20 nanometer transistors on here than 7 nanometer. So, an SoC from Apple doesn't have chiplets. It is one die. And they do that because that gets the ultimate speed. But if you have some...
Well, it's a small SoC, though, right? AMD is making the equivalent of 1,000 millimeter squared EPIC chips.
Yeah.
For cheating, it seems to certainly have gotten them to the head of the line all of a sudden.
Yeah. It depends what you're doing. If you're not dependent on a battery, so that the game's free, right? You can do as big a chip you want. Apple's chips are about 100 square meters, and they have, I think the latest one has more than 10 billion transistors. In fact, you can look that up on Wikipedia or something. They track them, and you can see how big the dies are and how many transistors they have on them. But the growth rate is pretty startling. Apple has been able to grow their transistor count and their function count without growing their die size, right? And they can't because the phones are about as small as you're going to get them. So you can't do this big fat, hairy chip like AMD or Intel can. And, you have to have a special coolant and backup generator to power some of these things, right?
Well, yeah, and they have enough money. They're able to go to any fab. So they've made, chips at Intel before. They made them at Samsung. And now they seem to just be basically, of course, going with TSMC. I actually want to throw in a reader mail question here. So VI Pass writes in, just like you can if you support us on Patreon, it says, companies such as 3DFX, AMD, Intel, and others all have invested at one point into owning their own production foundries. And in some cases, it leads up to their death or near death of those companies. Well, it seems like a good idea to produce your own designs. It always seems to come back to be their own downfall. Why are large companies such as Intel, who owns their own sources of production, begin to fall way behind the curve to its competition. And it does seem to almost consistently happen. Like Intel is one of the last ones who still owns fabs.
Well, yes and no. It's interesting. He says 3DFX. That's a blast from the past. I remember working with them years ago, probably 20 years ago. They were one of the first graphics chip makers, very leading edge. Didn't have a happy ending.
Well, they changed the game, and they were all anyone talked about in PC gaming for like 2 years. Yeah. And then if you read history, it's just like that. They're gone. Like snap of the fingers. They made a couple of mistakes, and it was gone.
Yeah, they were here in Silicon Valley, so I had a front row seat to that. That was more of a management issue. But, the thing is that the foundation of semiconductors is manufacturing, right? So this is what happened when we did the Fabless transformation, when TSMC and, there were a dozen different foundries at one point in time. And, TSMC used to be 2 to 3 process nodes behind Intel. And, it wasn't a big deal because TSMC was manufacturing chips for the mass market, and the mass market wasn't necessarily the leading edge. Intel had that with their CPUs, but a lot of the chips that were on the board were not leading edge, didn't need to be. So the volume of silicon that surrounded these leading edge chips was enough to, make you profitable and successful in the fab market.
I read that TSMC didn't even really have people using them as their main fab, that it was just basically extra capacity.
That really wasn't it, but that did happen later. But what it was is Morris Chang went out and said, "Hey, you guys don't need to build fabs. Anybody can do a chip. Just throw us your design, your GDS is what's it called, the file system, and we will make it." And then, all of a sudden, hundreds of entrepreneurs said, "Oh, geez, this is great. I don't need to do a business plan and raise $1 billion. I can just, design a chip on my spare time and, see how it goes." So it really was for first source manufacturing. And the real problem back then was that everybody copied TSMC. So if you designed a chip for TSMC, you could manufacture it at UMC, at Chartered, at SMIC. And so TSMC would do all the hard work, and then some of the volumes would go to other companies. So that was a big flaw in his business plan. And for example, I worked with a company, Qualcomm. They actually manufactured chips at 4 different foundries. And the reason they did that is because their margins were very thin. This is the big difference between Apple and a standard fabless chip company. Is Apple sells, systems, and they make, hundreds and thousands of dollars, where a chip company is making $5, right? Or $10. So the margins are pretty thin. So Qualcomm would say, "Hey, here's my design, goes to the highest bidder," and, they would split it up, and it would keep margins pretty thin. That's why we kind of went back to where we started when I was in the business, where systems companies were making their own chips. Now, we're back to that, where systems companies are making their own chips, but they're actually not manufacturing them. They're just designing them.
Yeah.
But they have good grips on the manufacturing because TSMC, doesn't compete with their customers. They're very good partners. The problem we have now, just to bring this up quickly, is TSMC really is the only foundry out there now.
Yeah, I see that becoming a huge problem for competitiveness in the next couple of years. I mean, pretty soon.
It's not good only having one manufacturing source for leading edge chips. And, I'm a fan of TSMC. They actually have a very good business model, but if they decided to be evil, it could be a real problem.
Yeah.
Google's mission statement at the beginning was "Don't be evil." Clearly, they threw that out.
They said, maybe not anymore.
Maybe we can be evil if we make a lot of money. So, luckily TSMC is a very moral, very friendly company. They've based their business model on customers. And because, you have to realize TSMC doesn't design semiconductors. And so.
And that's a decision, right? A decided move that we're just never going to do that.
Yeah. And, if you don't design the semiconductors, it's hard to manufacture them because you don't know what's coming down the road. So the ability to partnership intimately with key designers of semiconductors like AMD and Apple and some of these other companies gives TSMC the knowledge and the future ability to create these chips that don't exist today, that they're going to have to, invent new technologies and solve new problems. So they have it. As it turns out, they have the best of both worlds because they have access to hundreds of companies and hundreds of different types of designs, and they'll see every potential problem sooner than anybody else. Whereas Intel just makes one type of product really, or two, and that limits their focus and their ability to investigate. The other thing is it's just pure math. The ecosystem around TSMC is IP, it's EDA, it's customers, and these people spend trillions of dollars in R&D doing this, and they share all this knowledge with TSMC. If you're making your own chips, then you don't have that big of a budget, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, looking at TSMC, I would say the one thing that is hopeful is it's something I've been covering on my channel, is how much of Nvidia's next graphics card lineup is going to be, for the past few generations, they will make some of their lower end chips on Samsung. And it seems like this time, at least most of the gaming lineup, if not the entire beginning of the gaming lineup, at least for this year, was made on a Samsung 8 nanometer, which is really just a refined 10 nanometer node. But while that may be some performance loss versus if they were on the latest TSMC 7 nanometer that AMD is going to use, at the same time, at least that's money going to hopefully making sure Samsung can keep up with TSMC, because really Samsung's a full node behind TSMC at this point. When I look at their 5 nanometer feature set, you can kind of argue, right, that it's around TSMC's 7 nanometer EUV, but in reality, it seems to be even worse than that, despite them calling it 5 nanometer. So I'm hoping at least Samsung can at least get some larger partners now that, well, they may be at a disadvantage. Hopefully the cost makes it so it's worth it, and Samsung can keep up, because Intel isn't.
Well, I've worked with Samsung and these guys for 30 years, and really it's a cultural business model issue. Samsung is really, really keen on being the first to new technologies, and it's part of the culture of the company, and I'm sure the CEO says, okay, how many patents do you have? How many firsts do you have, et cetera, et cetera. But just because you're first to a technology doesn't mean you can actually manufacture it. and Samsung has had yield problems, serious yield problems, throughout their history, because they were first to a node. But TSMC is always first to high volume manufacturing. So you really have to separate the two: the first to announce going someplace, and then the first one to ship. And the problem TSMC has is they have some very big customers, and Apple is the game changer, because Apple needs a new chip every year for their iPod, iPad.
They will pay for it, yeah.
And they write some very big checks. And so, but back in the day, we didn't release a semiconductor process until it was done. So we would put up these specs and we would say, hey, Moore's Law, this is the process node. We need a full node transition. This is what we need. And we would hold it until we met those specs. And sometimes it would take 2 years, sometimes it would take 3 years, sometimes it would take 4 years. That's the history and the tradition of the semiconductor industry. And, for companies like Intel, they need huge yield because they're making a lot of chips. And if they're not yielding, they're going to lose money. So, TSMC started doing these things called half steps. And we used to do half nodes a long time ago. You would take like a 65 nanometer, and then you would shrink it and make it tighter because you had manufacturing experience with it. And then you could come out with a tighter, cheaper version. And we called those half nodes. It's not something we celebrated because it wasn't a big deal. And we didn't really have clever names for them. It was just, a better version of the previous process. So Apple and TSMC changed that. And Apple wants a new chip every year, a new process every year. So TSMC does these half steps. And so 10 nanometer to 7 nanometer to 6 nanometer, those are all tiny steps. And it's using the same fab equipment. They're just making improvements, right? So it's a different naming scheme. It's a different methodology. Intel is still trying to do the
mega
Moore's
ones,
Law thing where, 10 nanometer to 7 nanometer is going to be, twice the transistor density. Then they said, well, maybe we'll do 1.7 density, where TSMC is doing a fraction of that. If you look at the TSMC numbers, they don't compare half step to half step. So
No.
we just did their big.
You always have to reference
conference.
a few nodes back that they've been, for each one.
Well, for example, they just did this at their conference. They're comparing 7 nanometer to 5 nanometer, and that's a good jump, right? You get double digit performance increase, power, but they left off 7 nanometer plus and 6 nanometer, right?
Yeah.
Because the difference between 6 nanometer and 5 nanometer is single digit. But this is what the media wants to hear. Moore's law is still alive, blah blah blah. But the benefit of doing that, and this is what really is important in semiconductors, is the learning curve. When you're taking little steps, you can really accelerate at the learning curve, and you can find out what the problems are with the equipment, with the designs. I mean, there's so many people involved in this recipe. It's just daunting. And so, taking small steps, as it turns out, now that we know, is just brilliant, because TSMC is the only one, to get EUV yielding in high volumes. And, it's funny. There was a question from the media on, we did a virtual event with TSMC, which is the first time, and they had Q&A and stuff like that. And one guy says, how come you stayed with FinFETs at 3 nanometer while Intel and Samsung are going to a new technology called Gate-All-Around?
You already answered your own question. Go on, though.
Yeah. Well, actually, the answer to that question is because Apple said so, right? Apple can't take the risk of not yielding, and we have not seen Gate-All-Around yield yet. It's in the labs. It looks good. I'm sure TSMC will do it. But, they did the same thing with EUV. They brought EUV in at 7 nanometers. So here you already have 7 nanometer yielding. Everything's great. Then you introduce EUV, and you only do a few layers. You do a third EUV, and you see how that goes. And then with 6 nanometer, you do half EUV, and then with 5 nanometer, you do full EUV. So that cautious approach, as it turns out, is the way to go. It's not an ego brag. Real men have fabs. Real men, do Moore's law.
Well, real men actually manufacture products, I would say.
Well, I would say real men actually make money manufacturing products, because some companies don't. Samsung, the semiconductor business is such a small piece of their company, you don't even see it in their reports. You have no idea if they're making money on their foundry business or not. And even if they are, it's a very small amount of money, and it's all about yield, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I remember TSMC specifically giving some talks around the prolonged, shall we say, 28 nanometer era, where there was all this hype. Oh, there was going to be a 20 nanometer GPU, and that just didn't happen. They just made 28 nanometer again, 3 times. But then once TSMC hit 16 nanometer, they said, no, we're really going to have a 12 nanometer node. We're really going to have a 10 nanometer node. When we say we are, we've learned how to, the things that were preventing us from going from 28 to 16, and really from 28 to even 20 nanometer, we've learned those lessons. And it sounds like really at a macro level, the lesson they learned is stop with this ridiculous, everything has to get 10 times better mentality, and just take half steps over and over and over. And eventually, like you say, you can make fun of them for not comparing 5 nanometer to 6. But at the end of the day, new node coming out on time, 20, 30% better than before, as usual.
Yeah, it's so for us semiconductor guys, we know the difference between this stuff. When you design a semiconductor, you get something called a PDK, and it's called a process design kit. And you get these PDKs before the process is done. And what it is simulation models and complete descriptions of the process. So we don't really read an article and say, oh, I want this process because it's going to be better. We do a thorough analysis. So we actually know what all this stuff is. But, as a consumer, do you want a chip called 10++, or do you want a chip called 7 nanometer? I mean, realistically, they're kind of the same, but it's just part of marketing. And, Intel really has to get with the program and start matching, the other foundries. But, you brought up 28 nanometer. That was an interesting node. That was actually a tipping point for the semiconductor industry. There were two ways to go on 28 nanometer, and this was the gate first, gate last controversy. I don't know if you are familiar with it, but it's high K metal gate technology. We introduced a new technology at 28 nanometer, and either you did the gate first, and it's how you put the gate down on the die, or you do the gate last. And Intel was the first one to high K metal gate, and they chose one direction. And TSMC, they were a year or two behind Intel. They chose the same direction as Intel, but the other foundries, Samsung and IBM and UMC and Chartered, they chose a different implementation, and that meant that you could not take a design from TSMC and you manufacture it elsewhere. And what happened was, and this is a big historical note. TSMC, the other 28 nanometer implementations didn't yield.
Right.
And so TSMC is the only one that had 28 nanometer.
If the designs aren't compatible and the others aren't yielding, you'd be a moron to not just everyone flock to TSMC then.
Well, the problem is we were on allocation, and this is the problem that everybody fears, is you can't get enough chips no matter what, because they just didn't have enough. The other implementation, the other companies were supposed to make up half the industry, because TSMC is, maintained a 50% market share plus or minus. But all of a sudden, you lose half your capacity. So Nvidia, couldn't get enough chips, and because TSMC said, "Hey, listen, we need to be fair and share," and other companies weren't so happy with that. They said, "Hey, we're on your fab. We need more chips." So anyway, that's how it started. And then after 28 nanometer came FinFETs. And that is a huge difference, because FinFETs are not created equal. And that also changed our naming scheme. 28 nanometer, we used to name our processes based on the length of the transistor.
Yeah.
So they were two-dimensional, 28 nanometer, that's how long they were. So that was a very easy decision on how to name processes. But with FinFETs, they're actually two-dimensional. They have fins, and the bigger the fin, the smaller the base. So you really can't do the naming scheme. So now we just make things up. But what's funny is TSMC was a little bit more honorable in the beginning. They looked at Intel's 14 nanometer and they said, okay, well, we're not as dense as that, so we're going to call ours 16 nanometer, right? So TSMC called ours 16, but Samsung said, hell no, we're going to call ours 14.
Yeah, so did Global Foundries.
Yep. And well, actually, Global Foundries used the Samsung process.
Yeah, they had a
So it was the same. But you know what happened? Global Foundries failed. Their 14 didn't work, so they had to license it from Samsung. But the point is that TSMC and Samsung had the same process but different names, and TSMC had to spend a lot of their day explaining why theirs was just as good as Samsung's.
It's actually better typically.
Yeah, even though it was named 16 and Samsung's was 14. But TSMC learned a valuable lesson of names really need to match for customers' peace of mind. So you don't want to extend the sales cycle or the marketing cycle explaining the technical details why your process is better, even though it's got a higher geometry name. But that's something Intel hasn't learned yet, and they're really going to have to get with it if they want to be a mainstream semiconductor manufacturer.
Well, I think there was a bit of time where the prominence of Intel, I mean, the amount of people I saw online, gamers going, well, Intel 14 nanometer is real 14 nanometer. And it's like, I mean, it's the most real. None of these are real, how we used to name them anyways. But the funny thing that I think might come up, although probably not, and we're getting a little bit into rumor territory here, is I believe that most of, as I said, NVIDIA's gaming lineup of Ampere is going to be 8 nanometer. I've been told that the reps for the Quadro side of NVIDIA are saying they will be manufacturing some of their top cards on 7 nanometer. Obviously, the A100 is TSMC 7 nanometer. But then there's also rumors of NVIDIA trying to get a hold or trying to effectively utilize Also, Samsung's new, and again, I put big quotation marks here, right? 5 nanometer EUV node. But the funny thing is, I know that, again, quote unquote, 5 nanometer node from Samsung, despite having a similar density to TSMC's 7 EUV, I'm pretty sure is quite a bit worse power characteristics. So it would be funny, in my opinion, if like you had a lineup that they put 5 nanometer on the box and then they underperformed the high-end product that says 7 nanometer from a different fab. And that would just go to show you how much of it is just straight up marketing now.
Yeah, the thing is that we write in detail on this. We have a couple of process experts, and they look at the transistor density as published in technical papers. So we have a lot of conferences, and you have to publish a technical paper, and it has to be, correct. That there's a lot of vetting that goes along. But the thing is that the tradition is to use an SRAM block. And it's a very tight embedded memory block. And, we say, okay, you can get this many transistors in an SRAM. So that is your density.
Right.
And that's fine. But what they don't say is, oh, well, that SRAM only has 10% yield. So you really can't design that. You have to give much more spacing. You have to do this and do this. So, it's impossible to tell which process is good for a GPU. And you can't compare it to an SRAM or a CPU or anything else because it's really a different animal. And so, just saying we're better because we're on 5 nanometer, wow, not even close. You have to wait till the silicon comes out and run benchmarks because you can't actually design to the specifications that they release in these papers and talk about, because that's best case scenario with a tailwind, right? And so the thing is that, as I said, Samsung is a little bit less stringent with their marketing vetting, and they always want to be first and the best, and it doesn't always end up that way.
First isn't the same as the best, right?
Well, best on paper, I guess you call it. But what you have to do is, look at the Apple processors year over year, look at the GPUs year over year. The reason why Nvidia is, just to give you the backstory, Nvidia CEO Jensen was very good friends with Morris Chang, and they started out together. Nvidia was one of their first customers. And at 28 nanometer, Nvidia wanted more die, and Morris said, no, you signed a wafer agreement. We do these things called wafer agreements. They're signed a couple of years in advance that says, hey, we're going to buy this many wafers. If we buy more, we'll pay more. If we buy less, we'll pay, we'll make it up to you. I used to do wafer agreements. They're very complicated.
And it's per wafer, it's not like per chip.
That's correct. And, we used to do wafer agreements on good die, but we don't do that anymore because, TSMC would say, hey, you have to design to these design rules to get the optimum die. Right. And Nvidia was the biggest offender. They said, no, we want to put more stuff. And then they wouldn't yield, and they'd say, hey, TSMC, it's your fault. It's like, well, not really.
Because Fermi, that just doesn't work.
Yeah. And I was involved in a couple of these, and it's like, you guys didn't even obey the design rules. You get these things called waivers. It's well, we want to cheat, so here's a waiver. It's like, well, okay, it's up to you, but we're not guaranteeing you yield. And then they don't yield, and then they blame, other people. But at 28 nanometer, that happened, and Nvidia couldn't get enough chips, and then the other 28 nanometers didn't yield, so that made it worse. So Nvidia started going to multiple sources, but they were sole source at TSMC, since the beginning of time. But as I said, if everybody's sole source to TSMC, that's not good, right? Because what happens if there's
I don't think everyone is going to be though, because I hear that TSMC is fed up with Nvidia as much as they used to be friends. That they are just so fed up with. At least, and this is what I'm told, right? I can't pretend to speak for everyone who works at any of these companies, but like what and you gave an example. Anytime something goes wrong with an NVIDIA architecture, it's the foundry's fault. And NVIDIA is very demanding I'm sure they pay well, but without paying writing Apple's checks, that big of a check, that I just hear that they are very hard to work with sometimes. And that from the sounds of it, they're now pushing pretty hard to become big partners and prop up Samsung. I guess we'll see how well that works out.
So here's the problem is with TSMC, they have an inner circle of customers that they rely on for R&D. And ever since the separation of processes where you can no longer manufacture a chip on everybody's process, and this happened at 28 and then at FinFET, there's a lot of secrets involved. And in order to be in the inner circle of TSMC, you have to sign some very big NDAs, and you cannot manufacture at other companies for X amount of time. So you have TSMC secrets, so you can't go over to Samsung and manufacture at Samsung because TSMC secrets are going to be involved in that. And it's just something that has evolved over the years, and TSMC is really keen on protecting their secrets, so people don't take their chips away and manufacture them elsewhere. And so, what happened was Nvidia was in the inner circle, of course, from years and years. But and I don't know if you remember or if you noticed, but now they have another inner circle player called AMD.
Yeah, they're big old friends with them.
Now, this is recent. So at 14 nanometer, AMD was manufacturing at Global Foundries and Samsung. They were actually plug compatible. So anything Global Foundry couldn't make, you could second source over to Samsung pretty easily. But, TSMC says, hey, we're all friends here. AMD is going to get the same access that you do. And as you can imagine, that didn't go over well with Jensen, right? So you're treated as, a VIP, an EVIP, and then your competitor's sitting, next to you. So it happened to a couple other companies. In the FPGA world, Altera and TSMC were best friends. And then Xilinx came over to TSMC, and then Altera left and went to Intel, because it's really hard to differentiate when you have the same manufacturing process on an FPGA. And GPUs are a little bit easier to differentiate. There's a lot of secret sauce inside those things, but still having an equal level playing field in manufacturing didn't really sit well with Nvidia.
Well, I mean, what I've also read, and again, some of this is publicly available, some of this goes into rumors and behind the scenes gossip, but that Nvidia validated their entire lineup at Samsung in addition to TSMC, and they had them bidding against each other, and they were threatening TSMC, hey, give us the inner circle like we want, or we're leaving your foundry. And TSMC said, okay, bye. And it sounds like, of course, again, some of their products are going to have to be made at TSMC. Again, A100 is made at TSMC. That's their top end product for data center. Well, for certain tasks, not all of them. And I mean, honestly, from what I'm told from behind the scenes is that NVIDIA didn't expect TSMC to do that, and that this is actually throwing them through a loop right now.
Yeah, they did the same thing with Xilinx and Altera. Then they did it with Qualcomm. And, when Apple came to TSMC, Apple got even better treatment than Qualcomm. And, Apple used to buy chips from Qualcomm, right? And they were competitors. And they sued each other, So having Apple at the same table with Qualcomm didn't really suit them. So they went over to Samsung as well. But it's not like they're moving products back and forth. So again, there's wafer agreements that are signed, 2 or more years in advance, and there's NDAs signed. So they can't actually design the same product to the same foundries. So Nvidia is designing some products to TSMC and some products to Samsung, and they're going to do that because
they can't literally be the same, right? There has to be some changes. It is a different node.
Well, they can't be the same team. The same design team can't design on Samsung and TSMC because there's confidentiality agreements.
So it'd have to be enormously expensive or infeasible to design literally everything at both.
Yeah, it's not done because it's really not feasible technically or legally. So what they have to do is they have to decide on the process technology when they start designing. And so they get the PDK, they sign the NDA, and they say, okay, this one's going here. But, NVIDIA has many different product types, right? Some of them will go TSMC, some of them will go Samsung. I mean, if you go exclusive to one company, you don't have the pricing benefits of competition. And Samsung is known for really good pricing because, again,
yeah,
their foundry business is buried inside. They don't have to make money. In fact, they probably don't because their yield is so bad. But, at 10 nanometer, Qualcomm put their products over on Samsung and it didn't yield. And so Qualcomm had a big problem. They couldn't get the volumes that they were requiring. So that's a big problem when you deal with Samsung. So nobody's going to put all their eggs in Samsung's basket, I guarantee you. But Nvidia is doing the right thing. They're putting products on TSMC and Samsung, keeping Samsung viable and in the loop. Because again, with only one foundry, it could be a problem, especially when you have political issues. Is China going to take over Taiwan, and then will they cut us off from the semiconductors? I mean, there's a lot of issues involved in this. It's not just which wafer is cheaper.
So yeah, it's still a constant debate amongst gamers and the rumor. So there's actually probably a decent amount of PC gamers looking to buy an Ampere graphics card in the next few months, listening right now to this part of the conversation with bated breath. You are basically saying, like, if we hear whatever, the RTX 3080 is on Samsung 8 nanometer, or let's say it turns out it's on Samsung 5 nanometer or whatever, that you're saying, oh no, the entire thing is going to be on that. There's no special version probably coming from TSMC.
No, technically it's not feasible, and legally it's not feasible. So these things are designed from the ground up. Once they're designed, they're not going to move to different processes. It takes too much. These processes are very different, and then you have the legal entanglement of NDAs saying that nobody that's seen the TSMC 5 nanometer can work on Samsung 5 nanometer for 2 years.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that means gamers pay attention to whatever Nvidia announces in 1 week. That's what you're getting for the next year.
Yeah. Do they always tell you which process nodes is on, or do they leave that to the rumor mill?
Well, so I mean, eventually, right? I'm sure it's going to be on the box when they're selling them in a couple weeks, or I guess it'd be, from what I'm told, about 2 weeks or 3 weeks from now for the 3090 and the 3080.
The 3090 and 3080 are two different chips, right? So those could split fabs. 3080
is cut down from the 3090 based on what we know. So it's most likely, and that's what, right? I was wondering if they put, the smaller the number, the bigger the die, the top of the lineup. So GA100, 102, 103, 104. The small, so 100's their mega 800 millimeter squared data center chip they're selling right now for a $10,000. But it's still, AMD basically tells you almost a year ahead of time sometimes, RDNA 2 coming on 7 nanometer. And Nvidia, we still don't technically know for sure what it's on. And we just know, I just have been told that it's been validated on Samsung. And yet I know the Quadro team at Nvidia is saying that it's on TSMC 7 nanometer. So there's multiple people within Nvidia saying different things. So it's becoming it's one of those crazy rumor mill things that no one's quite sure of yet, no matter how much information they get, because not everyone's saying the same thing.
Yeah, well, Apple is exclusive to TSMC. AMD is now exclusive to TSMC.
Pretty much, yeah.
Nvidia and Qualcomm are not. And so that'll tell you something. But, again, it's nice to see another fab in business. And I personally would like to see Intel go back into the foundry business. I think if they did it more modeled after TSMC versus, telling you that they're going to knock TSMC, off the charts, which is what Global Foundries did and Samsung did. And, these companies spent billions and billions of dollars trying to compete with TSMC only to fail. Intel only has to beat Samsung, right? And they can become number 2. And beating Samsung is not that big of a deal, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But I would like to see Intel get back into the foundry business just so we have another option, right? Because these are the only 3 companies that are going to be able to develop these leading edge processes, right? Samsung, Intel, and TSMC. And, if it's only TSMC, that just is an uncomfortable business situation, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I know Global Foundries said, we're going to focus on markets that, we can cater to more, so that's not going to take as much of an investment, to get to the newest node. But at the same time, it's like, well, yeah, but TSMC can also just make more money and double their capacity and then make it so everyone wants to use their node, right? And I guess let me bring up this question here from Potatoes Our Life. He says, do you think that Intel will go fabless like AMD? And if so, who do you think they would partner with the most?
Well, so no, they won't go fabless. But you have to know that Intel is one of TSMC's top customers. So Intel makes chips at TSMC. They always have, and they always will. How many chips they make, who knows? But Intel has made a lot of acquisitions. So, for example, they bought Mobileye. Mobileye is on TSMC. They bought Habana Labs. They bought Nirvana. They're all on TSMC. And they bought a bunch of mobile companies, Fujitsu, Infineon. They were all on TSMC. So, why would Intel move these chips from TSMC to Intel when Intel's capacity is at a maximum, right? They've been on shortages, and I don't even know if you remember last year, they couldn't ship enough chips.
Yep.
And I think they're pretty much, it's on allocation. I think they're pretty much in the same way. So here you have these CPU chips that have huge gross margins, whereas these Mobileye chips are, small and not big margin. Why would Intel use their fabs for that? So Intel, you can call it Fab Lite. I don't know what you want to call it, but they have always used external fabs for different chips, and they will continue to do so. So the big question is, will Intel do a GPU at TSMC? And Intel pretty much said they were last call, which is a big departure, because usually it's chips not developed by Intel that were at TSMC, acquisitions they made. But their GPU, they made themselves. And on the call, it was said that they were going to be sourcing outside of Intel. They didn't say who, but if you think about it, it actually is very logical if you think about it, because these are gaming GPUs, right? These aren't the ones that are going in the cloud. These are the cost-effective ones, going into the game systems and such. And if you think about it, they're competing against AMD and Nvidia, who mostly is on TSMC. And so they're going to have, a good cost comparison, and it's going to come down to architecture. And that's not a bad way to be. Unfortunately, Intel's got a big ego. Is their architecture better than the other guys? Well, they probably think so, but we'll find out.
The marketing team definitely thinks so.
Yeah, I have my doubts. But so in theory, they are Fab Lite. They always have been. But if you think they're going to put their CPUs over to other foundries, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, what I've actually been told is that behind the scenes, Intel may have already negotiated with TSMC to be their introductory partner for that 6 nanometer EUV thing, and that they want to announce that with a bunch of fanfare. That's one thing I've heard. That
with
actually
what chip, though? With what chip?
I think it was their DG2 gaming chip or something like that. Yeah. So it'll be like early next year gaming chip. Here's the thing. This is the argument I've made all last year, is that do I think Intel will go to other foundries for some of their chips? For sure. Do I think they may do some select products on a smaller node on a competitor's foundry to keep a performance crown? Maybe, but that they're always, at least for the time being, of course, going to need to use those fabs because they just have them. And if they're not using them, they're losing money, even if there's a performance loss. But I don't know. The problem is they continue to be so behind. And I guess that's what you're saying too, right? Is they're going to have to solve their problems. I mean, there's a reader mail here from Eddie Drummer, or it's Emmy Drummer, 1990. He says, is there a chance solving 7 nanometer for Intel is just too important for them to ever give up? Is it that they actually need to solve 7 nanometer at their own foundry, or is it to not lose face to investors?
As I told you, process technologies are delayed all the time. So,
especially if you're Intel.
No, everybody. Samsung. The only thing is Samsung will never admit it, right? They came out.
No, they won't. They won't admit it that they're not making almost anything on their 7 nanometer EUV.
what's funny is they came out with 10 nanometer announcement, and it was a couple of years ago, and they called me and they said they wanted me to cover the press release. Samsung is a sponsor of SemiWiki. Just about everybody is. We have 60 sponsoring companies, but we're not going to tell a lie. And I told him, I said, hey, listen, I know who your customer is. It's Qualcomm. They told me you're at 5% yield. I'm not going to write this up, because I can't in good mind, get on the bandwagon of you being first to 10 nanometer when you're not yielding. And, they said, oh, well, fine. But, the thing, and if you could look at SemiWiki, go back and Google Samsung 10 nanometer, we didn't cover it.
I think I remember, I remember that press release too, and being like, okay. And then like a year and a half went by, and I was like, "Where's the products, guys?" Yeah.
So, but Intel's not like that. And when they went to 22 nanometer FinFETs, they kept it secret. Nobody knew anything about it. It was a total shock to us that they had FinFETs in production. But if you look internally, when you don't have an announced date, then if you're delayed, it's not a big problem, right? So it was delayed, and 14 nanometer was 2 or 3 years late. 10 nanometer was a couple years late. There was a couple rumor sites that said, 10 nanometer has been canceled. It's like, what, are you kidding me? It's just late.
It's not canceled.
We're all late. It's late.
It's
right?
very, very late, though. You have to admit, and I think that from what I heard, that there were very real discussions within Intel about canceling it. But a discussion doesn't mean a decision. Right. And I think I remember those rumors, 10 nanometer is never going to be real. And it's like, well, I mean, it is real. You can go to Best Buy. It's up for debate how good their 10 nanometer is. That's always up for debate. But I can go to Best Buy right now and buy a 10 nanometer laptop from Intel. So you can't tell me it's not real.
Yeah, the point is, so, I grew up with Intel. They're right here in Santa Clara. I know so many people there, but more of the people I know now from Intel are no longer with Intel. Mm-hmm. They had a huge turnover. But they've actually hired people from Global Foundries and Samsung. I mean, they really have mixed it up. But the thing is that Intel has always been late. They give their best guess, and it never works out, because that's the way semiconductors are. You make one change in the process, and the yield can drop, double digits. Mm-hmm. So it's just hard when you have transparency like this to really do these huge advances with doubling your transistor capacity in between the processes. So, 7 nanometer, they said it's 6 months late. And then I read in the news, 7 nanometers doomed, 7 nanometers done, 7 nanometer will never happen. And, unfortunately, that's the click culture we're in. But the fact of the matter, and this is business as usual, they will finish 7 nanometer. It's not that big of a deal. It doesn't have EUV. EUV is a big problem. TSMC has figured it out. They're the only one. Are you
sure their 7 nanometer isn't at least partially EUV? I thought they were buying those ASML machines.
I believe that's going to be for their next process. Maybe I have that wrong. Maybe their 7 nanometer is EUV. I think 10 nanometer was not.
10 nanometer is not, no.
Yeah, but so it could be EUV. With 10 nanometer, they introduced some new materials. They introduced cobalt. And, the new materials don't always have the reliability that you hope they do. With EUV, TSMC did it right. They dipped their toe in. They said, okay, let's do 3 layers, see how that goes. EUV the problem is throughput. It takes so long to EUV these wafers, and these machines go up and down. And so it's really more.
I've heard the yields on EUV is actually better and more reliable. It just takes forever to make them.
Yeah, it's better because it's less complicated. You have less masks. So, you have to use dozens of masks to make a wafer. And so it's a big complexity reduction. So it's easier to manufacture. It's easier to yield. It's just these EUV machines are still becoming mature. And so, we'll see how that goes. But I'm not sure. I'll have to look it up. We have specs on 7 nanometer. I'm not sure how many layers of EUV it has, but that's the thing is you can start out with 3 layers and say, hey, I have EUV. Well, not really, because it's supposed to be 20 layers.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I guess people are now already how would I put it? They're early predicting the death of Intel 7 nanometer because they had so many 10 nanometer problems. And it's funny, I don't know what they delayed it to. I think they delayed it to 2022, which is funny because all of the information I had talking to people within Intel is that thing was always going to be 2022 anyways, despite them saying it was late 2021. And I don't know. I mean, I think Intel will have 7 nanometer by the end of 2022. I mean, if they don't, it would be a disaster, to be honest.
Right. Well, you have to remember they have different parameters. So when they say they have 7 nanometer, they better have a lot of chips made.
Right.
When foundries say we have 7 nanometer, that means our customers are ready to design to 7 nanometer. That doesn't necessarily mean the chips are in production in systems on a shelf, right? So, TSMC says they have 5 nanometer in production. What that means is they're making chips and they're shipping it to Apple. They won't actually be out on the shelves until the end of the year, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a different environment. Intel, if they say they have 7 nanometer, people want to buy chips, and they better have a lot of them because people want to buy a lot. So I don't actually know when 7 nanometer is going to be out, but it's not dead.
Neither does Intel. Yeah, Intel. It's actually out.
Not dead. It'll be out sometime next year, but probably not high volume manufacturing until.
Gosh, Reese, why does Windows 10 Professional have to be so expensive? Don't listen to that, nerd. Listen to me. You can get all the great Windows and gaming keys you need at CDK Offers. I have a plan. Go to cdkoffers.com to get all the Windows Professional and Microsoft Office keys you need, and games as well. Add them to your cart, and you can even apply one of them City Slicker promotional codes like DashRink for 3% off software and Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows codes. I do have an account on this website, and it is ultra easy to use. Just submit your order, use PayPal, credit card, or Bitcoin, and go to Windows website to download Microsoft Professional. One more time, that's go to cdkoffers.com. They are a fantastic sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead. Use offer code DashRink for 3% off everything on the website, and Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows products. Now, back to the show.
Sayonara writes in, and he says, in July of 2019, Bob Swan publicly admitted that Intel was too aggressive with density scaling from P1272 to P1274, but also noted that our 7 nanometer node will be out in Q2 of 2021 with double the scaling. Of course, by now they've delayed that to 2022, so it's clear that the progress is not being made at the rate Intel would prefer. How much of the delay would you attribute to the following? 1, unrealistic goals. 2, poor risk and project management. 3, lack of investment and direction. Or are there any other things that you would point to that caused Intel's delays for their new nodes?
I think Intel is still suffering from the Moore's Law, culture of we have to double capacity, double the transistors every year, every 2 years. Moore's Law said every year, then he said every 2 years, and he said every month. And really, Moore's Law was just an observation. Gordon Moore just says, "Hey, look at that. Hey, look at that. Oh,
that's changed." What I keep saying to people too. Is it's an observation, guys. That's why my channel's named Moore's Law is Dead. But I mean, and Intel does say it all the time, though. Still,
the funny thing is, it's a good marketing term, right? TSMC uses more than more.
Oh yeah, now they do. Because they can, yeah.
Yeah, so more than more means, hey, it's not just the transistors. We do packaging, we do this, we do that. And so, it's fun for us people to talk about Moore's Law has a stroke, Moore's Law is dead. The sad thing is Gordon Moore is still alive, right? So we should show him some respect. But it's just an observation, but it's a culture is built behind that observation. And in Intel, anything less is a failure. And so, they have a very different culture than some of the other semiconductor companies that you see around.
Yeah,
that's their falling, right?
When I met some of them in person last year, obviously not this year, I haven't gotten to meet anyone really in person, but it was interesting how they kept behind closed doors, they really didn't talk about it that much, but the managers did in any presentation with Intel. Moore's Law this, Moore's Law that. I remember saying it almost feels like it's a religion for Intel, Moore's Law.
Yeah, and you got to think it's killing them not being the best. It really, because they've been the leaders in this industry, since day one. I mean, they helped found this industry.
Right.
But for them to say, oh my gosh, we're a node or two behind TSMC, that's got to kill them.
Yeah, and meanwhile, TSMC's presentation at Hot Chips last year, the guy walks on stage and says, "I'm here to tell you Moore's Law is not dead. It's not even sick." And then just starts laughing, showing like his comparison to Intel. It probably doesn't feel good.
They said that again yesterday. Moore's Law is not dead or sick. So maybe that's their new shtick. I didn't hear it before.
I mean, it got a lot of laughs, so I'm sure it's one of the best bits to go with. Confirmed SK writes in, and he says, there was no way AMD was coming back if they hadn't gone fabless, in my opinion. I mean, would you agree with that sentiment? Because I think there's an argument to be made that people saw AMD spinning off Global Foundries as an act of desperation. But in many ways, it seems to just have been an advantage, an instant advantage the second they did it.
Yeah, it was very good for AMD. You have to look at the finances behind that, right? So the company who spun that out was from Abu Dhabi, and they had a huge investment in AMD, and then they own Global Foundries. So originally, that really was a financial coup, a clever way to make a lot of money. But as it turns out, AMD just wasn't able to execute on the fabrication side, and they've had some big runs with CPUs. I remember buying AMD 40 megahertz CPUs because Intel only had 36, and that 40 megahertz meant a lot to me at the time. But they really haven't been competitive with Intel for many years, right? The single-digit market shares, they really were just around. The same reason why Samsung is around, because you need an alternative. You need somebody to keep Intel competitive. You need somebody to keep TSMC competitive and keep them honest about their pricing and stuff. So AMD got by on that for quite a few years. And by the way, I'm a big fan of AMD, but really they've had some catastrophic failures on the architecture side, not just the manufacturing side. So,
we don't need to talk about Bulldozer.
Actually, I was there during Bulldozer. Boy, I worked for an IP company that was involved in that. I've seen so many horror shows, and the majority of the chips do not make it in this business. You just don't hear about those. But when AMD went fabless, it was a big deal. They got funding, they got direction, they could focus on coming up with new architectures. And what is this? 8 years? I don't remember exactly how long ago it was, but it is a pretty big milestone for the company from where they are today. And so, they had to go fabless. Otherwise, they would have died.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it continues to be a huge advantage. I mean, point number 6 here I have in the notes is this comes from your book, Fabless, as well, just talking about, how risky and how much of a kind of insane investment a fab really is. It requires absurd amounts of money and expertise. And then that fab is really only useful without an upgrade for like 3 years, because pretty soon you need the newest node. And that there's just so much risk involved. And again, it makes me ask, we kind of covered it, but like, why do you think, and it almost is just Intel at this point, insists on keeping this risk? Or I guess the better way to ask this probably would be, for how much longer do you think Intel will insist on keeping its fab business as its main manufacturing model? Do you think they will slowly distance themselves more and more and maybe eventually spin it off? Or do you think that's not going to happen within the next decade?
Yeah, I don't think it'll happen in the next decade. The thing is that Intel putting their own GPU onto another foundry, most likely TSMC, is a huge step. You have to realize that Intel fabs are very different. They are built for high performance products. They're not built for mobile, for low power, and that's why they really haven't succeeded in that market, and that's why they use TSMC. So TSMC is not as fast. The transistors are different. Intels are built for speed. Thankfully the cloud needs chips and speed more now than ever. So Intel is going to be making a huge amount of money on these CPU chips. So I don't think they're going to stop that, but I think they will put out more products on TSMC, especially when they have head-to-head competition from some of the other guys. But extremely high-performance products, I think, will always be made at Intel. And you can't even get Intel to stop with the Gordon Moore stuff, right? So how are you going to get them to stop making fabs? I just don't think it's ever going to happen. You'd have to wipe out the entire employee base and hire new people.
You're saying whether it destroys them or not, they're not doing that.
No, I don't think so. But by the way, I don't think it'll destroy them. I think they'll come around. Very, very brilliant people over there.
Pyroxide writes in and he says, what happened to Global Foundries? Did they just get left in the dust and become irrelevant compared to TSMC, Samsung, and Intel? I haven't heard anything about them since their IP dispute with TSMC.
Well, when Global Foundries came out, it was a big deal, right? They were going to be the global foundry, so they would have foundries everywhere. And one of the drivers was the money from Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi wants to, make their revenue base broader other than oil. So they're, looking at other markets and other technologies. And semiconductors was one. They wanted to build a fab in Abu Dhabi. But, the reality is that's not going to really boost employment. Having a fab in Abu Dhabi is really, there's no reason to, other than silicon's made from sand and you got plenty over there. But, you can't get your employees to go over there and such. So the global foundries concept was a very sound one. We'll put foundries everywhere. And, they cut a deal with China. They put one in New York. And then they bought some from IBM, which was very clever. I worked with Global Foundries for quite a few years. I'm a big fan of theirs. But the bottom line is they could not produce a competitive process. They never got one out. They made the wrong choice. It was always
more leaky
nanometer.
Or lower performance, didn't clock as high, despite being the same node in quotation marks.
Yeah, they chose the wrong direction at 28 nanometer, and didn't yield, and then they had to come back and make changes, and everybody was rooting for them. Everybody was,
of course, they're the underdog,
Right. We all wanted alternatives. We wanted to go back to the good old days where you could design something and have 4 manufacturing sources so you can get a good cost, because cost is everything for semiconductors, right? But, either here nor there, it just didn't work out. And they failed at 14 nanometers, so they licensed Samsung. But you have to think, it's a license, right? It's not something you own and control. And Samsung can provide better pricing, and you lose your business, right? Because Samsung doesn't need to make money on their foundry business if they don't want to. And then Global Foundries tried to do 7 nanometer, and I pushed them to skip 10. I said, hey, don't do 10, go right to 7. You got to get lock in step with TSMC. But it didn't work, and they have some very brilliant guys from IBM over there because they bought IBM, but it just didn't work. So funding was turned off effectively. Abu Dhabi put in, 10 billion, 20 billion, and Global Foundries was very well liked because they wrote some big checks to the ecosystem. But they just never really got the customers and the volume. So IBM themselves used Global Foundry. AMD used Global Foundry, and I think that's really something that held AMD back, right? Because they weren't on
especially
processes.
with some of their products.
Yeah, and they didn't have the manufacturing expertise that TSMC is giving them, right? So AMD's in the inner circle. So it's a good thing that AMD was able to cut that relationship off. And I know there were financial ties. I don't know what all was involved, but it's unfortunate. So Global Foundries is now what you call a boutique foundry. They're doing clever things, FDSOI, power.
Yeah, some of those nodes look actually pretty impressive, far more higher, like as some would say, real 12 nanometer, and it seems to perform pretty close actually to some of the smaller. Well, I guess again, it's all marketing. Some of these smaller marketed nodes. It's just I wonder where they can go next. Right, you're not the best, and if and they're not Samsung either. So, do you think they will try to skip to 7 or 5 nanometer anytime soon, or do you think they're just going to shrink? Or
no, they're done. They're not doing any advanced node work right now. My guess is they want to go IPO. the Abu Dhabi people need to get their money back somehow, or as much of or some money back somehow. So either they'll be sold or they will go IPO or something like that. But the problem is it's not sexy in the semiconductor world. Unless you're doing 5 nanometer and 7 nanometer and EUV, it's just not sexy.
Well, what if they just call it 5 nanometer? Apparently, you can just do that. So
that's what I say. Nobody will know the difference. But and they don't have the capacity. They got a couple fabs in New York, a couple fabs in Europe, and some older fabs in Singapore. But they can't, come close to the capacity that AMD or one of the big companies needs. So they're going to be, a boutique foundry, just like Tower Jazz and some of the other folks. There's a new company called Skywater that does fabs. They bought some old fabs. So there's plenty of business out there, but it's just not sexy.
Well, that brings me to another question. So John O'Shea writes in and he says, is there anyone set for a comeback to challenge TSMC in the next 5 to 10 years? It seems like they're running away with it with the successful 5 nanometer rollout, and they've got 4 and 3 nanometer nodes coming, as far as we can tell, on time. I mean, do you see anyone coming to challenge them? Do you think Samsung will even, or
no?
You think TSMC is just in the driver's seat for forever, or?
I think Samsung and Intel both have the ability to compete with TSMC. I just don't think they have the culture or the business model. You can change that. That's the good news. Samsung is a memory company, really, and Samsung makes huge investments in memory, and those investments, overlay with logic. Not one-to-one, but it is very complementary. So Samsung is going to continue. Intel, of course, they're going to continue. They have to. That's who they are. Could they be a successful foundry? Yes. And I tell them all the time they should go back into the foundry business, but they shouldn't go back in saying they're going to beat TSMC. Intel went into the foundry business a couple different times, but the last time was maybe 5 years ago with the new CEO, BK, and he came out and said, you know what they said? They said the Fabless business isn't scalable. They can't go where we can go. I mean, it was a big hoo-ha thing, and it really pissed me off. So people call me an Intel basher. That's when it started, because I was just really offended that they took issue with the Fabless business model. And I certainly hope they would fail just out of spite, but they did, and now I feel bad. But if they would have come out and said, hey, we're going to be the number 2 foundry, you need US based manufacturing, you need, multi-sourcing, that would have been a different story. But coming out and saying we're going to beat TSMC, and they went to TSMC's top customers and said, hey, they can't go where we can go. And, it was just a business strategy that just failed miserably. And, Samsung is in the same problem. Apple was Samsung's biggest customer, and then, they might have borrowed their IP, and, so IDM foundries have a certain taint to them, but we could change that. And I think we're going to have to, because you can't just have one foundry. It's just not smart.
Again, at a certain point, I think you would just have other people backing Samsung or Intel more eventually to make sure that there is another competitor. I mean, a lot of AMD's business, not all of it, AMD's always made some good products in any given year, some. But at a certain point, you think it was clear, I think some OEMs were backing AMD when they were at their lowest, simply because they knew AMD had to stay together. I mean, there was even a rumor that during when AMD was right before Zen, when AMD was at its poorest, that Sony was even thinking about buying a big share in AMD, because they're like, dude, we can't lose you. We're not buying our console stuff from Intel and Nvidia.
Yeah, a certain percentage of AMD's business is because they're not Intel. And that is how Samsung is surviving now, because they're not TSMC. But, at some point in time, you have to bust a move and get out there and get business, because you are better. The value proposition is higher for your customers than your competitor. And so far that hasn't happened yet. And, Intel was fun because, they have a very big ego, and they said, hey, we can do things they'll never be able to do. Yeah, well, that was interesting until we got their PDKs, and their PDKs didn't match up with their marketing. Right. So I think there's opportunity, and I hope it happens, because cost of a semiconductor is everything. We have to get cheaper every year. And Samsung provides some very attractive costs. I mean, because they don't need to make.
I've heard it's way cheaper. Yeah.
The last one I heard was 30%. And if you can save 30%
per wafer compared to TSMC, or is it 30% lower?
30% lower than Samsung, but still, Tom, 30% is a lot if you're selling chips, right? If you're selling big systems like Apple, laptops or phones that cost $1,000, okay, it's not that big of a deal. But for the chip guys, it's a lot. And so Nvidia and Qualcomm, they're good targets for Samsung, but they have to deliver consistently.
And I'm sure Nvidia will push those costs to the customer and give us all cheaper chips this year.
Yeah, I don't think so.
No, I don't either. DJ5K writes in and he says, "Hey, Tom, a very interesting guest. Does Daniel have an opinion on a fab independent metric for measuring a process density? I mean, there's different features, but Steve at Gamers Nexus talked about a paper a while back that proposed a trifecta of numbers that represents the average density of different transistors and their constructs."
Yeah, there's a guy on SemiWiki. He's one of our writers, Scott Jones. And Scott does modeling for the semiconductor industry, and he's been doing it for the last 30 years. And he has a metrics that he uses for calculating density. And it has to do with the geometry of the layers, the pitch and such. And so he pitched this a couple of years ago. He said, "Hey, listen, this is the only way to determine how dense a chip is." And he wrote some papers on it. I mean, if you go on SemiWiki, it's under Scott Jones, and he pitched it to Intel and TSMC and such, and it makes some companies look better and it makes some companies look worse. And as it turns out, it makes TSMC look better and it makes Samsung and Intel look worse. So nobody really agreed to it, but it's what we use. So every time there's a new node, Scott writes an update and he does a landscape article, and it's the most read. It's widely quoted.
Oh yes, I've read them. It's like the almost only place you can go to really compare the newest nodes in a, I think, objective and fair way. Like, what are we really talking about here?
Yeah, the thing about Scott is he doesn't have a horse in the race, and his business is modeling. And if his models aren't correct, he goes out of business. So he does a lot of reverse engineering, and he publishes it on SemiWiki. And then if it's wrong, people will tell him immediately. So he gathers information. But yeah, he's the only unbiased source for this type of information that you'll see. But it's highly technical and it's really detailed. But it gives you numbers. And he will tell you what the logic density of a chip will be versus the SRAM count on a good day, right? And so, but really, he exposed people, to not necessarily being truthful with their numbers, and that doesn't make you the most popular guy, right?
Yeah. QH Freddy writes in and he says, "Is there a growing rift between these leading edge devices and those built for more cost-constrained sectors? How has design and verification changed in recent years with the rising difficulty of accessing the newest nodes, accompanied by more difficult to implement features such as serial speed memory, interconnects, and specialized circuitry like internal voltage regulation and other non-logic elements becoming commonplace on leading edge designs?"
That's a big question.
Yes.
My experience is heavily in the EDA world and IP world. So EDA is the software tools that you use to develop semiconductors. And I've been involved in quite a few EDA companies. In fact, even today I do mergers and acquisitions in the ecosystem. And so I've been involved with maybe 10 or so. And one of the big changes for design and verification was FinFETs. We were doing really well until FinFETs, but FinFETs is a very different device, and it broke all of our tools. And it was crazy. Some companies were doing okay selling tools, but people didn't want to buy new tools because they didn't have to. It's like, do you really need a new GPU because the other ones run fine? Well, when FinFETs came out, tools started breaking, and that's when the partnership with TSMC became critical because they helped us understand how we could fix our tools to manage FinFETs and the new processes. Since FinFETs was a complete reset. We had to develop new tools, new methodologies, all new IP. I mean, it was pretty big for our industry. We made a lot of money because Qualcomm and the other guys had to buy new tools, which is hard to get them to do. But the problem we have going down, and this again is a nice deal for TSMC. TSMC is taking us down this path in half steps and smaller steps, so we can fix our tools and our IP in a much easier manner. If you're going on huge steps like Intel and Samsung's trying to do, it's just very difficult. So, the answer is yes, it's hugely difficult. But the opportunity is for TSMC to help with their ecosystem. So they have the biggest ecosystem ever because they rely on customers and partners to put in money. And, I've experienced it as a customer and a partner. I've never actually worked for TSMC, but it's a collective of the most brilliant people you'll ever meet. Semiconductors are hard. We all have masters. Most of us have PhDs, in physics, electrical engineering, material science. We're solving some very big problems, but this new cadence that TSMC has with Apple really have enabled our industry to solve these problems bit by bit rather than, a big old shark bite, right?
Mm-hmm. Just like when you talk about how brilliant these people are, going to some of these conferences, you're used to maybe in your neighborhood being a pretty smart guy, but then you go to one of these conferences and it's very humbling when you realize how much smarter people can actually be than you. They're ridiculously smart.
I'm never the smartest guy in the room ever. But in some of the industries, that I hang out in with my friends, boy, I seem pretty smart, but not in semiconductors.
Yeah, Snails writes in, and this is kind of switching gears a bit. He says, how soon do you feel that some of the growing Chinese fabs will become competitive in the global market? Do you see them as more of a potential budget node competitor over the next 3 to 5 years? Or do you think Big Red is just going to hack its way to the top?
Big Red.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time in China. In fact, I was in China during the outbreak of the pandemic. I was there at the end of January for...
Are you patient zero in America? Can we blame you?
My neighbors were very wary of me, but I did an acquisition in China, and so we were there celebrating. And I was in a banquet with over 500 people, and the next morning, my wife texted me about the pandemic and told me to come quick.
Yeah.
So I got home at the end of January, and I was quarantined immediately. My wife was sent home from work. She was quarantined. And, it was very unnerving, but no, I've been tested 3 times. I don't have the antibodies and I don't have it. But I could have been patient zero for my town anyway. But I've done business in China for 30 years, and there's a foundry over there called SMIC. I worked with them in all different capacities. And I had high hopes when they came about because, again, I wanted more fabs to keep the industry forward. So it's always in my best interest. I don't wish bad on anybody. I want there to be more choices. But I tell you, I worked with them for about 10 years, and I was disappointed. They borrowed things from other companies. They got
borrowed
sued
in quotation marks.
Yeah. Here's the thing: is a lot of people say China's stealing our IP, and maybe that's true. But we've been borrowing each other's IP in the semiconductor industry since day one, right? Semiconductors really started with Fairchild, and then I don't know if you read the story about the Tradewar 8 left Fairchild and started Intel.
Oh wait,
IP,
maybe I have a little bit.
Yeah, IP goes out the door with employees all the time. And if you look at people's LinkedIn profiles, which is a nice little spy tool to find out, who's who, you can see that, everybody's worked at Intel or Fairchild. Yeah. There's certain companies that have spawned entire industries. Are you calling that IP theft? It happens all the time, right? You can't control what's in an employee's mind. But in this case, SMIC actually downloaded documents, which that's full-on theft, right? So they paid for it. TSMC used to own, I think, 5% of SMIC as part of the settlement. But even then, they couldn't really be successful. And SMIC is at 14 nanometer now. They have a lot of TSMC employees, UMC employees. They have billions of dollars from the government, and they're still just not able to really move forward. So I don't think so. Will there be fabs in China? Yes, there's many going up, but will they yield? It's harder to yield than you might imagine. So I think hopefully our trade negotiations will calm down after the elections, and we'll start partnering a little bit better with China. But I don't see a possibility of them making their own chips, in the next 10 to 20 years.
That are not remotely comparable to like what TSMC is making, you mean?
Yeah. They're at 14 nanometer, TSMC's at 5, right? That's a pretty big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way, and you can tell me, of course, if this is an ignorant perspective, the way I kind of see it is, I mean, look, they can probably keep up to a certain degree, but at the same time, if it depends how much of their innovation is literally from stealing and how much borrowing they're doing, because borrowing is a good shortcut in the short term. But if most of your innovation is coming from quote unquote borrowing, then you're never really learning how to innovate on your own. And so the second you start isolating, right, isn't it just going to be you're going to fall behind faster because you actually were depending on that borrowing the whole time?
Well, it depends which employees you borrow. If you're borrowing production employees, you're going to be able to produce at that given capacity. But you're not getting the geniuses that are bringing in new capacity. I took a tour of China a few years back, and this is when they were going to do the memory thing, and they've already done it. But this was before that. And they were showing me the facilities, and they said, this is going to be our Korean village. We're going to have Korean restaurants, and here's the housing facilities. And I'm like, well, I wonder where you're going to get those employees from, right?
Yeah.
And then they had a Taiwanese village, and it's just like, okay, well, that's pretty blatant. You're going to go after these certain companies, but SMIC has had many, many chances to be a great semiconductor foundry, and they're not. So that does not bode well for their future. And part of it is cultural, because I think the government has a lot of involvement in their foundry business, whereas Taiwan, the government is really hands off, and so I think that's a problem.
It's almost like Taiwan isn't a communist dictatorship.
It's not at all. I mean,
that's what I'm saying, though, right? Is it's like you get someone like, insert name, some giant genius who's worked on fabs before, and it's easier to convince him to move probably to Taiwan or New York or what have you than it is to within China, especially right now. And I mean, it's just something that I think you can hype personally. I think you can hype it up as much as you want, but is that problem still going to be there, preventing a brain drain into China? Probably.
Yeah. There's been a brain drain from the United States, and in the semiconductor industry, when it first started, the predominant people were me. You couldn't pick me out of a crowd, right? But it's changed, right? And so you can pick me out of a crowd, and very easily, because I'm an old white guy. But in Taiwan, it's a very big blend, right? So if you look at the Taiwan culture, their mannerisms and their culture is not really Chinese. It's got a huge Japanese influence, because Japan, occupied them for a while. It's got some Korean influence because, Korea occupied them. It's a very big blend. And when you do business in Taiwan, it's different than China, a lot different. And it's more amiable to the American way of doing business.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Right. So if you get people to work between them, it's probably more likely.
Yeah.
Lewis 1992 writes in and says tensions between the U.S. and China will continue to rise for the foreseeable future. Will we see more companies open chip manufacturing facilities in Europe or Africa, like TSMC is trying to do in the U.S.?
Yeah, during TSMC's presentations, they talked about all their fab expansions, and they're expanding fabs in Taiwan only. So the U.S. fab wasn't even mentioned. And, so it's not a done deal. Nothing has been done, actually, other than a press release, with the current political stature.
Yeah.
But you have to wonder what's going to happen in the election. TSMC is not going to sign up until that is resolved.
Sure.
because it's a long-term commitment. The thing is that it's going to be more expensive to manufacture in the U.S. because the Taiwanese government helps TSMC. They give them free land, free this, free that, a lot of cost advantages. And I don't think the U.S. government has really picked up on that, or I don't know if they're going to be able to do that. I've seen things talked about, bills for, made in America. That would be great, but they have.
Yeah. Well, switching gears a little bit then, Andrew S. writes in and he says, what are some of the biggest hurdles to moving forward with more advanced nodes like 5, 3 nanometer and beyond? Is it the light source, the optics, the mass, or all of the above?
It's all the above, but really it comes down to materials that we use. So anytime we change materials, there's always, a possibility of failure. And this is what happens to Intel quite a bit. And this is why TSMC has stayed with FinFETs for 3 nanometers. Gate-all-around is a new technology, new materials, very clever. It's been in the conferences for a few years. We've written about it extensively, but there's a lot of unknowns on how to manufacture that in high volume at a reasonable cost. So, it really is all about the materials, and we're finding new materials for different things. Back in at 1.13 micron, which was 10, 20 years ago, we switched to copper for certain layers, and that was a catastrophe. That was the one of the most delayed nodes we've seen in the semiconductor industry, and we just didn't see it coming. We're pretty arrogant sometimes, not as much anymore because we've seen some glorious failures, right?
Yeah.
But it's the materials, and we're always discovering new materials. They look good in the labs, but you never know until TSMC goes out and manufactures. So when TSMC says gate-all-around isn't ready for high-volume manufacturing, I would tend to agree with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I mean, I guess I'll also throw in this question because it kind of connects to it. John O'Shea writes in and says, is there anyone but ASML making EUV machines, or they have the market cornered? What do you think their outlook is like? And he's trying to ask as if this is investment advice, which I think we have to legally say this is not investment advice.
Yeah, so ASML has an interesting history. EUV has been a long time coming. And, they've been saying it's around the corner for the last 10 years. And it was kind of a joke. There's a conference here in Silicon Valley called SPIE, and it really is a lithography conference. And so EUV was the most spectacular failure for the longest time, but they finally got it right. And, it was their partnership with TSMC that really brought things to light, I guess, as you might say, pun. It was a huge failure, and they've spent billions of dollars on this. They are the only ones that do it. And now that it's in production for the first time, by the way, full EUV, 5 nanometer. And, Intel is going to do EUV at 7, but we don't know how many layers. And, we talked about before, if you only do 1 layer, is that really EUV? I mean, you can claim EUV, but not the case, because there's about, if there's 40 layers, 40 masks in a chip, only probably half of those could be EUV. And, so we don't know how many layers they're going to use, but these machines are huge. They're expensive. And the throughput is not what you might have hoped. So you have to have a lot of these machines. And I think ASML has been selling as many as they could make for the longest time.
You have to get in line to get one.
Yeah. And by the way, memory makers don't use EUV yet. So memory makers are at 10 nanometer, I think. So they're behind the nanometer curve than logic.
Yeah.
But so you're seeing all logic EUV production revenues from ASML, and it's through the roof. So wait till the memory guys get a hold of this stuff, and ASML is going to do well. No investment advice. I don't own their stock. I don't think I do. But they have it locked. And that's one of the things that the U.S. government is doing is they're saying, hey, you can't send EUV machines to China. So China doesn't actually have any EUV machines. They're trying to make their own. They bought one and they were reverse engineering it, and that didn't work well. I mean, these are very delicate machines. Yeah. So EUV is our savior right now because it reduces the steps for semiconductors manufacturing. But it's got throughput issues, and they're going to need a lot of them. I don't know how many TSMC has. They tell us, but I think TSMC has more than anybody.
Yeah, I know. And I know that Intel's bought some a couple of years ago, and they're trying to utilize them, right? But all I've heard, like I said, right, all I've heard is that it's a line you have to get in, and that it can take years sometimes to get your order.
Yeah, and we mentioned this with Intel. Its ego is a big problem. So they say, yeah, we're going to do EUV. Well, if they only did 4 layers, they might not be delayed. But they said, hey, we're going to do full EUV 20 layers. So it's 20 layers or die. And they could die theoretically. The process could be delayed. But,
I think they'd be wise to try to do some type of 8 nanometer first. That's like half EUV or something. I mean, that's what we've been discussing, right? That's what TSMC's been doing, and it's worked. It's kind of common sense.
Well, you don't know it until you do it. But if you look back now, I mean, it's just pure genius. And the only reason why TSMC did it is because Apple made them do it. They wanted a new process every year. And so, but it has turned out very well for them. But, for Intel to say, hey, you know what, TSMC has figured this out, I think I'll do what they do, because TSMC did that with Intel. They followed Intel, a few technology steps. But you have to be real humble to follow your longtime competitor, right? So that's a difficult step.
Yeah, the meeting them in person, I get the sense that Intel's way more humble than they were a decade ago. But I don't think you still get the feeling that there are parts of the company that still aren't quite, maybe, shall we say, adequately humbled yet.
Yeah.
All right. Results for Life writes in, and he says, what is your view and knowledge about the emerging foundry business model from the likes of companies like Skytech, Tokyo Boki, I don't know how to say that group, of catering to startups and smaller customers by providing low-scale R&D production and custom manufacturing processes? I don't know if you saw this question or the links he put there.
Yeah, I did. I don't really get it. Those are really off the brand, off the road companies. What people are doing now is they're repurposing fabs. Mm-hmm. So, companies like Cypress Semiconductor had their own fabs, and now they're getting rid of them. They're 200 millimeter fabs, and they're repurposing them. And equipment too. There's used equipment on the market. A lot of it's gone to China, but if you can find a niche, go for it, right? There's MEMS fabs. MEMS are very big in the mobile business and in automotive, and sensor fabs are very big in mobile and automotive. And TSMC is not going to address those, right? Mm-hmm. They are big mainstream makers. They actually do MEMS, but it's not a core focus of the company. So there's a lot of opportunity for these companies. The one I know is SkyWater. So SkyWater took over some fabs here in the U.S., and they're going after the government market, which makes sense because they're U.S. fabs, right? Global Foundry has some U.S. fabs, but they're owned by a foreign country. IBM has U.S. fabs, but they're owned by a foreign country now. So having U.S.-based fabs for aerospace and military makes sense. But it's a market niche, right? And TSMC is not going to address that. It's just not sexy stuff, right?
Yeah. Ian Clifford writes in, and this is kind of tying into what we were talking about with Intel. He says, I recently watched a video on Intel by an ex-engineer, Francois Pied-Noel, on the state of Intel. Do you think that things at Intel are as bad as he suggests, or can the restructuring stop Intel from becoming the next GE? Which is a good question, I think, too, because I interviewed off the record. So, it's technically an anonymous source in one of my recent videos where I went through some quotes from kind of honestly political civil wars going on within Intel. I mean, how bad do you think it really is inside the company with regards to those types of subjects?
I have a lot of friends at Intel, but I don't have any direct knowledge. But most of my friends no longer work at Intel, like the gentleman you talked about. And I actually saw his video when it came out because it was kind of a big deal in Silicon Valley. I don't agree with everything he said. He has a cultural issue as well. So, he's not from the U.S. And people are treated differently, in different companies from different countries. You're not necessarily part of the inner core workings. But Intel has gone through a transformation over the last few years. I did an article on this as I went and looked at all the CEOs they've had and, their education and everything. And one thing you'll find is that most semiconductor companies have highly technical CEOs. Nvidia, Qualcomm, everybody. These guys have PhDs or at least masters, and Intel was no different. You look at the educational credentials of the first few CEOs of Intel, and it's from the highest levels that the world offers. That changed a couple CEOs ago. And, the last CEO had a bachelor's degree in chemistry from San Jose State. And, that was just, to me, a disaster in the making. And I wrote about it. I said, hey, listen, how is this going to end well? Because this guy is not technical. And, well, he's been at Intel for 30 years. Well, that's not necessarily a good reference. And then the CEO now, I actually had high hopes for him because he was a financial guy, but he's a very clever guy, but he's not a semiconductor guy. And so it's easier for the rest of the company to pull his leg, per se. The less technical your executive staff is, the more opportunity for your other workers to maybe not present the accurate picture. So I think that's probably happened at Intel. The masses of executives are just brilliant people, but unless you have a brilliant leader and one that really knows what's going on and one that can see through the nonsense, I think that company's going to have trouble. I look at companies based on their CEOs to determine whether they're going to be successful or not. Mm-hmm. When people ask me for investment advice, so I spend a lot of time on Wall Street explaining them what companies do and such. And I did a tour about 4 years ago. I said, hey, listen, here are the top companies because of their CEOs. And one of them was Nvidia, and I still get a Christmas card from these guys about Nvidia because they made a huge amount of money. Yeah. But Intel, I tell you, they really need to get back to their core business with their executive staff. And, you got to start at the CEO.
Yeah, what I've heard about the current CEO, Bob Swan, is that he's probably a decent guy to try to clean up and restructure the company, but that some people, disregard him because he isn't technical. He doesn't have a technical background. But at the same time, the truth is the truth. Like, he can't stay there for very long, or Intel's going to continue to lack the, shall we say, the correct leadership for what it needs to drive forward again as, like a technological innovator.
Yeah. So, TSMC had a keynote speaker from Ampere. So you mentioned them. You're familiar with the company and their chip?
I was referring to the Nvidia architecture code named Ampere.
Okay. Well, there's a company called Ampere, and it's founded by Renee James, who spent 28 years at Intel. Mm-hmm. And she left Intel 3 years ago and founded her own company, Ampere. Right. And it does.
I've heard of this company, though. I have.
It does chips for the cloud, right? And it's so funny is in her talk. I wish they would publish this because I guess she didn't leave Intel on the best of terms because she really had an axe to grind, and she never even mentioned the Intel name. She just said, this is the difference of doing business with TSMC, and it was just a complete knock on Intel. And then she said she's hired a staff of executive professionals, the top of top. And I went and looked at their executives, and they're all Intel people. I mean, this whole company is all Intel. I'm surprised she didn't get sued, or maybe she did, for taking all these people. But I'm sure she's got a good shot at it. But she really did an advertisement for working with foundries, and hopefully Intel watched this video, or somebody from Intel watched this video, because it really made some strong points on some of the changes that they have to make.
Yeah, I mean, the sense that I get is the engineers within Intel and a lot of mid and upper management are starting to get the idea, right? But there's still, man, when I was at Hot Chips last year in person, I was at the Hot Wings at Hot Chips that Posh, ask Raja Koduri and Jim Keller anything. And both Raja Koduri and Jim Keller were, I would argue, too honest with their answers, honestly. They clearly hadn't rehearsed for this. And they were just like, yeah, we think that idea is actually a bad one. Yeah, we think that one's a good one. But the more business side of Intel there seemed to have no, and this is a couple of years ago, so maybe things have changed, right? But still seem to have no perception of how bad the security problems were getting and how disillusioned some people they were working with, or mad, right? Like you're saying, how mad some people that work with Intel are getting. And so that just concerns me, because you say, like, earlier, oh, Intel will swing back. I'm not too concerned about that. But when we talk about it, it's like, sounds like they're going with an aggressive 7-nanometer node again. It sounds like even when they get to that node, they'll be competing with TSMC 3-nanometer. And it sounds like we're still not sure they've figured out internally, that they've come to terms with what's going on. So I don't know if I'm really asking you a question, but like, I think there is real concern there that they can bounce back. I think they probably will, but I think people both shouldn't underestimate that they can, nor that, I don't know, there's definitely the groundwork laid for them maybe not coming back and kind of doing what happened to IBM. I mean, they're not going to go out of business, but never being the juggernaut they once were. I don't know if you disagree.
Well, I'm not sure if it's really for me to say. I have high hopes. I have high hopes.
Me too.
Because I grew up with them, and I have the utmost respect for them. But I'm kind of like Jim Keller, and I'm a pretty blunt guy, and
who left Intel?
Yeah. So I actually have run into Jim a few times. He started at Apple and then went to AMD and then went to Tesla. So he moves around a lot, but he is very outspoken. But, I've consulted with many different companies, and, I tell it like it is, because that's my reputation. And if the baby's ugly, it's ugly. It's just nothing to do about it. But, Intel, I've had some very harsh criticism for them over the last few years. And, sometimes it sounds like they're listening to me, and then sometimes it doesn't. When they first came out with the FinFET, they called it a Tri-Gate. Well, the industry word is FinFET, so they tried to rename, an industry term, and they failed, right? And now they're coming out and saying, oh, well, our SuperFin technology, well, that's just dumb. And, they probably paid a marketing consultant $1 million to come up with these stupid names. But, it tells me that they're not learning their lesson. Right. And they need to play nice in the ecosystem if they want the ecosystem to play nice with them. And if you write some big checks, you'll get our attention, but you're not going to get our allegiance. You're not going to get our best effort. So I think Intel still has some ways to go. But if I had to call it today, I would say, probably 20 years from now, they'd be IBM.
Yeah. Okay. But again, and it's like, I hope they don't, but at the same time, I suspect if they did, Apple or someone would take their place, right? Like someone's going to come for that money. Well, frankly, AMD might, and then Apple may become a competitor. I don't know. But again, rampant speculation a little bit there.
If you look at, it depends how AMD is going to do. AMD just didn't do anybody any favors the last few years. But now they're doing quite well. So, without competition, companies tend to get stagnant. It's just the way it is, right? Because you don't have anybody pushing you. So AMD's pushing them on one side. Plus, there's dozens of companies that are doing chips for the cloud, like Ampere. There are AI chips for the cloud. All sorts of stuff that are going after Intel's business. So, at some point in time, they're going to be forced into a very unattractive competitive position. It hasn't happened today. So, that they can float on, the Titanic can keep moving because there are no icebergs ready to sink them. But AMD is making good strides. I actually didn't believe it would happen. So, but it has happened. And there are so many chip companies out there shooting for them in the cloud that something's going to happen. But it's not in the next 5 years. It might be 10. And I don't care what nanometer Intel's shipping. They're going to change names and call it different things to confuse us. But the fact of the matter is the cloud is everything, and Intel owns it. So until that changes, they're going to do quite well. But in a competitive market, Intel would fail. There's no doubt about it.
So switching gears again a little bit here. Looking around, I get the sense that we will keep using silicon. I know everyone keeps hyping up all of these other things, whether it's like carbon nanotubes or graphene. I think graphene probably looks like a likely alternative eventually. But I think we'll probably keep using silicon until at least 2030. And I've seen, some people say for many more decades. I mean, and that brings me to my question. In your opinion, how much longer do you think silicon will be the standard, or at least be almost the only material people are using?
That speculation has been made for years now. We've come to the end of the line, for silicon dozens of different times. And, as I said, there's some really smart people in this industry. And, this is way above my pay grade. I understand nanotubes and nanowires, and that is coming. But, there's still going to be a silicon aspect to it. But what we've done is we keep dodging bullets, right? We're just so smart, this industry, and every time somebody says, "Oh, you're not going to be able to do this," people take that as a challenge, and it's not just an ego thing, though. Just huge amounts of money are at stake here.
Yeah.
It's billions and billions of dollars, and that attracts good talent. So I don't think anybody is going to be able to say with a straight face that silicon has come to an end, because we can reference back, a dozen different times people have said that.
I mean, yeah, I would say if we get to 3 nanometer, we've already proved a lot of those people entirely wrong. I mean, many people said we couldn't get below 7 or 5 nanometer. I think, the obvious problem is, look, I don't have the statistics or the material properties pulled up, but it's like graphene can get significantly hotter, right? It can probably clock way faster, and it can probably become like half as big as silicon. I don't believe it can shrink to like, at least again, right? They think theoretically, we don't know for sure, like 10 times smaller. It's maybe just half as big, but it can clock way, way, way higher due to its thermal conductivity properties. But the thing is, the first graphene chips are probably not going to be the best. People have to remember we have decades and decades of optimizing silicon. So the problem with going to graphene would be that it doesn't just have to be better at the base level. It also has to be better than the hyper matured and specialized silicon we have now. And I see that as being, I really think what we're going to just find is 3D stacking solves a bunch of our issues anyways. And we're probably just going to use graphene here and there for a while.
Yeah, so this question was asked of TSMC, and of course they didn't answer because they're not going to tell people. But the big question is, what are we going to call it, right? So you go from 3 nanometer, which is FinFET, to 2 nanometer, which is carbon nanotube, to 1 nanometer. Well, what's after that? So the marketing guys are going to have to come up with some clever names, right? Because we've been riding on the
I'm sure Samsung will at least market something as half nanometer. They will. I don't know if TSMC would do that.
0.5 nanometer. So we'll come up with some other name, but it's not going to be as easy as it's been since 16 nanometer. You just go down a couple here, and it really means nothing, right? So what really means is the materials you use. But TSMC did say that they were working with high mobility channels and some 2D materials, and carbon nanotube most certainly, and nanowires for the 2 nanometer node. I think that's coming within the next 5 years, certainly. I mean, it's in the labs. IBM has some working prototypes that they can't manufacture. And the race is on because it really is, billions of dollars at stake here. So,
well, yeah, and I mean, if someone does it, they just have, double the efficiency of their competitors. And that's huge.
That's the dream. But, the problem is you have to manufacture it at a very high volume at a very low price, or a cost-effective price, to succeed in the semiconductor industry. So that's the other side of the sword, right?
Yeah. Results for Life writes in and says, what is the prevalence of open source instruction sets and architectures like RISC-V and Open Power on the market today? Are they still mostly in R&D and a handful of products like Alibaba, Nvidia, Sci-Fi, and Kendrite? Or are they gradually being integrated and adopted by more chip design houses like Broadcom, Qualcomm, Samsung, MediaTek, Apple, AMD, and Intel?
Yeah, that's a good question because I did my second book on ARM, and so really what happened was people stopped. Really, the ARM was the only choice, right? And this is just another example. If you only have one choice, things aren't good. ARM maybe is not as competitive. Their pricing is changing, etc. So RISC-V came in to really keep ARM at bay,
right?
But it really has caught fire. So the benefit I have is with SemiWiki is I get to see who reads what, when, and where, and what trends, and we cover ARM, of course, and we cover RISC-V, and the RISC-V traffic is huge. And I get to see where it comes from. And it's not in the US, by the way. The bulk of the traffic is from India. It's from Asia. China is huge on RISC-V because they've had real big problems with ARM and the different legal issues and the contractual. But ARM is really expensive. So, the question is, can they get the type of performance that ARM does? They don't yet. So ARM is the leading edge 64-bit embedded processors. RISC has a good 32-bit. They're still working on it. But I tell you, everybody's reading about it. And I think it's going to come, but it's probably going to be a few years out before people really start making money on it. But, it has to happen because there's only one game in town, and that's ARM. And they got bought by a much bigger company, Sunsoft. And I think maybe they've lost focus.
Nvidia might buy them.
I don't think that's going to happen, to be honest.
You don't think so?
Oh, what you think Apple's going to let that happen? I don't think so.
I mean, one thing, I've heard two things, right? I've heard that Apple already has a license up to a certain level where they can just split off and make their own derivative of ARM. That's actually what I've heard too, is that Apple considers this a start of their own architecture anyways, and that they only need the licenses, and they have the most recent one, and that should be enough for a while. So that's one thing I've heard. And also, I guess what I would say is, if I was Apple and you thought that was a problem, I would just buy out a large stake of ARM so that Nvidia can't directly control it or something. But
ARM's strategy was to go IPO. And I understand that because the mothership needs cash. They made some unwise investments in, WeWork and Uber and such. Going IPO is a big deal, and they could do that. And it doesn't even have to be in the US, right? They could do it in China or Japan or anywhere. But the thing is that a lot of companies depend on ARM. And they do, Apple and Qualcomm and other companies, they license the instruction set. Right. So they can get away with licensing. But again, there's a lot of collaborative work that's done between ARM, TSMC, and Apple to get these chips actually manufactured. Right. So ARM is one of the partners. Every test chip that goes out at TSMC has an ARM core on it. And, TSMC depends on it because if they can't manufacture ARM cores, then a lot of their customers are going to be really sad. So there's more to it than meets the eye. If Nvidia bought it, TSMC would not be happy. Samsung is a huge ARM user, right? They're from multiple points of view. So I don't think the industry will allow any one company to buy ARM based on the legal and the competitive issues or the restraint of competition issues. But I do think that people could buy pieces of that. Apple wouldn't have to do it directly. They have henchmen, right? They have Foxconn and a few other companies that would do it. But would the U.S. government allow a China, company to buy ARM? Yeah, probably not. So it's a quagmire. It really is. I don't see it ever happening. But it's good news. Everybody's going to click on it, right?
Oh yeah. I've seen many clickbait videos about it. I mean, I guess the only other thing I can say about RISC-V is one thing, and again, I keep referencing last year's Hot Chips because that was the one I got to go to in person. If you brought up RISC-V, well, I didn't have to. That's all anyone brought up. If I asked anyone their opinion on what's the thing coming that people are talking about that you're the most excited about, everyone talked about RISC-V. And I've seen people talk about how RISC-V is this efficient architecture, and that's why everyone needs to use it. But I think like you said, it's really not about its efficiency, although that's important. It's that it's open. It's that anyone can design their chips around it, and people are so hungry for something that isn't a minefield of legal fees, right?
Yeah, it's not ARM. That's the biggest attraction.
And it's not x86.
Right, just like AMD's biggest attraction is it's not Intel, right? So there's a lot of.
Well, it used to be. I mean, I'd say they're better now, right?
They are
most of the time, but
they are. I think they've probably doubled their market share. So part of their market share is because they're not Intel, single digits, but now they're actually winning on merit, which is very nice. I don't think RISC-V is winning on merit yet. I think it's got a little ways to go.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. All right, I got one more reader mail here. Again, everyone, if you support on Patreon, you can submit questions for guests. Doomberry says, oh, this is a great guest. Do you have any accessible resources to learn more about semiconductor engineering? I have read your articles with great interest, but I get a bit lost when you start talking about process characteristics such as polypitch or gate length. Where should we start?
Well, my book would be a good start. And you can get these books on SemiWiki if you're a member. They're free PDF form. So, in fact, my original book, I actually just updated it. So there's a 2019 version.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not even available on Amazon. It's just available on SemiWiki, and it is actually available in Mandarin now in China. So it's a huge seller per se. But read the books, and you can ask questions on SemiWiki. We have forums, and the tens of thousands of people read this. In fact, I got the idea for SemiWiki from some of the gaming sites. I participated on their forums and stuff, and it was kind of a Wild West type experience, and they didn't really understand what I was saying. Yeah. This was back in 40 nanometer, and people were blaming TSMC for bad yield, and I tried to explain to them. I said, well, here's yield. If you make some bad decisions, your yield's going to take it. But anyway, so SemiWiki is similar. So we have a forum. You can ask. It's moderated, so it's very clean. You're not going to get attacked. But if you have questions, just ask them there, and or comments in the blogs. People are very nice. They will answer your questions. But it's not the huge traffic site like Anantech or something. It's really focused on people who are actual semiconductor professionals, right? But we're happy to answer questions from anybody.
And I will say, as I scanned through this book in preparation for this interview, it actually is, I never know what to expect, right? From a scholarly written book, but yours was very, very readable. I know that, and take that as a lot aren't. I'm just being honest. A lot of them are not readable, but yours really did read like a novel. Like it was easy to read and very interesting.
Yeah, I had my wife edit it, and I figured if she could understand it, anybody could, because she's not technical at all. And, I actually wrote it so my kids would figure out what all this is about. But really, the net result is they said, hey, Dad, how come my battery doesn't last longer? It's like, kids, I don't do batteries. But
do you like those clickbait articles you see? Like Stanford makes battery that lasts 1,000 times longer and charges 10 times faster. Could be in your smartphone in 2 years. And I'm like, I think I've seen this every 2 years and it's still not on my smartphone yet. I mean, it's getting better, but.
No, I like the ones that say Moore's law is dead.
I love
my
the
favorite.
Ones that say Moore's law is dead.
That's my favorite clickbait. Yeah.
The original name of my channel, actually, Moore's Law has been dead, but I decided it's too long. And it's just because I can't believe we even talk about it. It's not about Moore's Law. It's about, there's so many ways to scale performance. I can't believe we still obsess over this observation. That's honestly where my name comes from.
Yeah. I'm really happy for it because, when I started writing, nobody really cared about semiconductors. It was really bothering me because they were so important. So I started writing. And when the Moore's Law thing came out, I was really annoyed by it. I'm like, oh, my God. But now I'm so happy because now so many more people are interested in semiconductors just because somebody died. Moore's Law is dead. So, but, hey, it got you to read and it got you to help understand. And SemiWiki is actually the number one website for semiconductor design. And, we have millions of people that read this site. It's just humbling. And I don't think we could have done it without, clickbait.
No, and that's the truth. Well, I think we got through all the notes then. I really don't have anything else to bring up. I don't know if you have anything else you want to talk about or if you want to plug your books. And again, plug the website one more time.
Yeah, we started SemiWiki 10 years ago. My son and I did it. He was on break between his bachelor's and master's degree. And we just sat down for the summer and created this site. And it was just an amazing experience. And we never imagined it would be so successful, but it is actually, a thriving company. But the reason is there's so many of us involved. We have over 40,000 registered members, and to register, you have to give us your LinkedIn profile, so we know, these are real people. And the amount of knowledge we get from just writing and reading these articles, and then we get to look at the analytics behind it and see, what's real and what's fake. I saw Tesla guys on my website 6 years ago, and so I knew Tesla was making their own chips, right? Because of what they read, and Apple's a big reader, and I look at what they read, and sometimes they focus on a piece of IP, and then they end up buying the company. So I can look back and say, oh, now I know why they were doing this and that. So that type of analytics is really important, because unless you understand how we got to where we are today, it's really hard to predict where we're going to be tomorrow. So that's the bottom line.
Yeah. Well. Again, your book, it's, I don't know the full title. I just remember your book's name is Fabless. What was the full title?
Fabless, The Transformation of the Semiconductor Industry.
All right. I think that's where we'll stop then. Thank you for coming on. I'll put all of that in links in the description. And thank you for your time, and have a good day.
Thank you, Tom.
The following podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and select technical editing by Carbon Cry. You can find all of our information, including how to get a hold of us, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. And if you are a fan and would like to send mail or other hardware, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 10468, Peoria, Illinois 61612. And speaking of fans, without exaggeration, the patrons are solely responsible for the continued distribution of the content you just listened to. And so if you have some extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who would love to meet you. I am one of them. The Discord is only at $1, and at higher tiers, you get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the back catalog of Flyover States podcast, thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts, and other perks as well. And if you cannot afford to support us, please just share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media and Reddit. And give Broken Silicon and Flyover States a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. All of this really does help so much more than I think anyone realizes. If you'd like to advertise on the podcast or a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its fans supporting it. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels. Matthew McMullen, Tello, Steen, Benny Berlin, Justin Yunt, Thomas Rupp, I Love You, Lynn and Jim Bollocks, Joshua Albin, Muhammad Al-Kawari, Frederick Lau, James Crasted, Justin Parrish, Zachary Martin, Terrence Herod, Brad Medlin, Phil S., Courtney Elliott, The Ninth Dude, Greg Renegar, TSP CFS, Chrysantine, Night Rogue 77, The Mechanical Philosopher, Lebo King Kilo, Fatboy Diesel, Daniel Hyde, D. Kunke, Christoph Novak, Jack O'Neill, Matt Salem, Aaron Close, Sexy, VI Pass, Sadler, Isaiah Gosner, Alethros, Telos, Hey There's a Kitty, Greg T. Wanchik, Jacob Barber, Exoti, Hector Santana, Matthew Lane, Joe McMorrow, Jan Rauner, Robert Ducks, Drita Full, Allie Robertson, Eric Johnson, Jonathan, Job, Evan Dingle, Dominic Cox, Stefan, Original Ross, Sam MacArthur, Total Silos, O'Connor, Michael Costa, Andrew S., Blake, Aaron Keith, Kerry Baldino, Endless Loggins, Tom San Filippo, Justice Brennan, Ivan K., Trevor Powers, Sayonara, Alenia, Joshua Stavis, Daniel Nishbal, Franco Frederick, Hardware Numbers, Alex Harris Steele, Dark Rain 2049, Leighton Perry, Matt, Carlos Valdez, Carnivore Bear, Macdo 226, Zabra Zaber, Zlicky, Matin Porsagji, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Garan